The galaxy is vast beyond mortal comprehension, a sprawling void where countless horrors and wonders exist in equal measure. Among the endless darkness between stars, forgotten relics of humanity's wars drift through the cold vacuum, silent testaments to battles long concluded and warriors long dead. But sometimes, these relics are not entirely dead. Sometimes they wait, and sometimes they are found by those who should never have discovered them. This is the story of one such discovery. A tale of ancient technology meeting brutal curiosity, of sophisticated warfare culture colliding with savage ingenuity, of a warrior who had served the emperor in the shadows, awakening to find himself in a nightmare beyond anything his training could have prepared him for. This is what happens when the greenskin menace, in their endless hunger for war and scrap, stumbles upon something that was meant to remain lost forever. The Orks are a plague upon the galaxy, a fungal infection that spreads wherever mankind treads. They are brutal, savage, and possessed of a cunning that often catches their enemies by surprise. But more than their love of violence, more than their remarkable durability, the Orks are defined by one overwhelming characteristic. They loot everything. Vehicles, weapons, technology, even entire buildings. Nothing is sacred to the Orks if it looks useful or interesting. They scavenge battlefields with the efficiency of carrion birds, stripping away anything that might be repurposed for their endless war. And on one forgotten world, on the edge of a sector that Imperial records no longer accurately mapped, a band of Orks would discover something that defied even their considerable imagination. Something that had been sleeping in the darkness for 5,000 years. Something that wore the colors of a legion that dealt in lies and secrets, that fought wars no one else knew were being waged. They found a Dreadnought of the Alpha Legion. The discovery in the ruins. The world had no name in current Imperial records, only a designation that translated roughly to HD 778 Secundus, a notation in some forgotten cartographer's files that no living soul had referenced in millennia. It had once been a mining colony, established during the Great Crusade when humanity's expansion seemed unstoppable, and the galaxy appeared ripe for conquest. The miners had extracted valuable ores from the planet's crust, feeding the endless appetite of the Imperium's war machine with raw materials for weapons, ships, and armor. But the colony had died. Whether through Xenos attack, resource depletion, or simple economic abandonment, the records did not say. Perhaps the records had never existed in the first place. The Alpha Legion had always been thorough about erasing evidence of their operations, and this world had clearly been one of theirs. The ruins that dotted the barren landscape spoke of structures built for purposes beyond simple mining, facilities constructed with an eye towards secrecy and defensibility that went far beyond what any civilian operation would require. The Orks who arrived on HD 778 Secundus came seeking nothing more than a decent scrap. Their war had been rampaging through the sector for months, and their war boss, a massive brute called Gork Smasher Ironjaw, had been growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of proper opponents. The Imperial worlds they had hit recently had fallen too easily, the guard regiment stationed there providing only token resistance before routing. Gork Smasher wanted a real fight, something with teeth, but in the absence of worthy opponents, he would settle for good salvage. The Greenskins descended upon the dead world in a motley collection of rocks, asteroids that had been hollowed out and fitted with the crudest of propulsion systems and weapons. They crashed into the planet's surface with characteristic Ork disregard for landing procedures, carving smoking craters into the dusty terrain and immediately beginning their search for anything worth looting. The mech boys, those rare Orks whose genetic coding made them instinctively understand technology, led the scavenging parties with Gretchen slaves, scurrying ahead to sniff out the best locations. It was a mob led by a mech boy called Grabbits, who first found the entrance to the underground facility. The structure had been built into the side of a mountain, hidden behind rockfalls and the accumulated debris of 5,000 years of erosion. But Ork persistence and the natural fungal aggression that drove the greenskins forward led them to dig through the barriers, clearing away stone and metal until they revealed a massive blast door that bore markings that none of them could read. The symbols were High Gothic, mixed with cipher codes that only members of the Alpha Legion would have recognized. A multi-headed serpent intertwined with chains and daggers, iconography that spoke of secrets within secrets, of operations that existed in the shadows of official campaigns. The Orks, of course, understood none of this. They saw only a door that needed opening and metal that could be repurposed. Grabbitz ordered his grots forward with cutting torches and explosives, and the greenskins set about breaching the facility with their characteristic lack of subtlety. The door held for nearly 3 hours, a testament to its construction. But eventually, even Alpha Legion engineering could not withstand the determined assault of Ork explosives and mechboy ingenuity. The blast door groaned, buckled, and finally tore free from its housing, crashing inward with a sound like thunder that echoed through the ancient corridors beyond. Stale air rushed outward, air that had been sealed away for millennia, carrying with it the faint scent of sacred oils and ancient metal. The Orks poured into the darkness, their natural night vision allowing them to see what their torches barely illuminated. The corridors were wide and tall, built to accommodate space marines in their massive power armor. The walls were bare of decoration, save for the occasional Hydra symbol and directional markers written in cipher. The facility stretched deep into the mountain, room after room, revealing equipment that had been mothballed with military precision, creating a treasure trove that made the Orks gibber with delight. They found armories filled with ancient weapons, the kind that would fetch a good price from any mechboy looking to upgrade his arsenal. They found storage chambers containing ammunition in quantities that suggested this had been a forward operating base for extended campaigns. They found medical facilities equipped with surgical tables and stasis pods, though most of these had long since failed, their occupants reduced to desiccated husks. They found communications arrays that still flickered with residual power, broadcasting automated distress signals into the void that no one had answered for 5,000 years. But the true prize lay in the deepest chamber, in a vault that had been sealed with more than simple locks and blast doors. This chamber had been warded with technology that the Orks did not understand, shielding systems that flickered with failing energy as the greenskins approached. The mechboys sensed power here, the kind that made their genetic instincts fire with possibility. Grabbitz personally supervised the breach of this final vault, using every tool at his disposal to crack the seals that had held for so long. When the vault finally opened, the Orks found themselves staring at something that even their violence-obsessed minds recognized as significant. The chamber was vast, easily 50 meters across, and dominated by a single massive figure at its center. It stood motionless on a raised platform, surrounded by cables and tubes that connected to monitoring equipment that still blinked with faint power. The figure was humanoid, but enormous, easily 3 times the height of an Ork, its form encased in adamantium armor that bore the patina of vast age. It was a Dreadnought. Even the Orks knew what that meant. They had faced such machines in battle before, had seen their own kind crushed beneath the massive power fists and torn apart by the devastating firepower these walkers could bring to bear. But this one was different. The Orks had fought Dreadnoughts painted in the proud colors of various chapters, had seen the bright livery and battle honors that Space Marines wore with such pride. This machine bore colors that were muted, almost deliberately obscured. What paint remained was a deep blue-green that shifted in the torchlight, metallic and impossible to fix with the eye. The Hydra symbols were small and positioned in places where they would not be immediately visible. More significantly, the Dreadnought was inactive. No lights glowed from its optical sensors, no hum of power emanated from its systems. The monitoring equipment around it indicated stasis, a deep and profound sleep that had lasted beyond the comprehension of even the oldest Ork in Gorksmasher's warband. This was a machine that had been deliberately shut down, placed in storage, and then forgotten or abandoned. Grabbits approached the silent giant with uncharacteristic caution. Even orcs understood that waking something like this without proper preparation could lead to a fight they were not ready for. The mech boy circled the Dreadnought, studying its construction with eyes that saw possibilities in every rivet and weld. This was not like the crude, deft dreads that orc mech boys built, with their rattling armor and weapons held together with wishful thinking and the psychic field that all orcs generated. This was precision engineering, technology that had been crafted by hands that understood the deep mysteries of the machine god. The weapons mounted on the Dreadnought's arms were particularly interesting. One limb ended in a massive power fist, its energy field generators dark, but still radiating an aura of barely contained violence. The other arm held what appeared to be a multi-melter, a weapon capable of reducing armored vehicles to slag with concentrated thermal energy. Both weapons showed signs of extensive use, scoring, and damage that had been carefully repaired. This machine had seen combat, had served in wars that were ancient history even by Space Marine standards. But it was the sarcophagus at the Dreadnought's core that truly captured Grabbits' attention. This was where the pilot resided, the Space Marine whose broken body had been interred within the machine to continue fighting long after mortal flesh would have failed. The sarcophagus was sealed, its armored plating covered in purity seals and inscriptions that the mech boy could not read. But sensors embedded in the casing indicated life within, a heartbeat so slow it was barely detectable. A biological system maintained in perfect suspension by technology that was beyond even Imperial understanding in the current age. Grabbits made his decision quickly. This was a find beyond any he had made before. A working Dreadnought, or at least one that could be made to work, would be a prize that could elevate him in the eyes of the war boss and the rest of the warband. More than that, it represented a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. The mech boy's genetic instincts screamed at him to take this thing apart, to understand it, to make it his own. The orcs set to work with characteristic enthusiasm, rigging lifting equipment and power cables to move the dormant Dreadnought. It took nearly 2 days to extract the massive walker from its mounting platform, to disconnect all the life support systems and monitoring equipment that had kept it in stasis for so long. The Gretchen crews worked under the supervision of multiple mech boys, each greenskin engineer offering contradictory advice on how to properly handle such a find. When they finally managed to transport the Dreadnought to the surface, loading it onto a massive salvage platform for the journey back to their rock, Grabbits felt a surge of satisfaction. This was his prize, his discovery. The other mech boys could argue all they wanted about who should get to work on it, but Grabbits had found it first, and by orc law, that made it his to do with as he pleased. He did not know, could not have known, what he had truly awakened. Inside that sealed sarcophagus, deep in stasis so profound that time itself seemed to have stopped, a consciousness stirred. Not fully, not yet, but enough to sense that something had changed. Enough to feel movement after endless stillness. Enough to begin the long journey back toward awareness. And in that first faint stirring of consciousness, that ancient warrior, that member of the Alpha Legion who had fought in wars that most of the current Imperium did not even remember, experienced something that 5,000 years of stasis had not prepared him for. He experienced the first whisper of terror. The warrior in the Iron Tomb. His name had been Kalen Vrask, though he had used dozens of other names during his service to the Hexath Legion. A chapter sergeant, a warrior who had earned his place among the Alpha Legion through cunning as much as martial prowess. He remembered the battles that had led to his internment, though the memories felt distant now, filtered through the haze of stasis and the trauma that preceded it. He remembered the mission that had gone so terribly wrong. It had been during the heresy, in those early days when brother turned against brother and the galaxy burned. The Alpha Legion had received intelligence about an Imperial army stronghold that was coordinating resistance against the War Master's forces. The intelligence had been good, verified through multiple sources, but it had been incomplete. What they had not known was that the stronghold also housed elements of the Imperial Fist's Legion, warriors who had been preparing to reinforce the defense of Terra itself. The ambush had been perfect, the kind of tactical masterpiece that the Alpha Legion specialized in. Vrask's company had struck from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinating their attack with cultist forces who had spent months infiltrating the stronghold's defensive networks. The initial assault had gone exactly as planned, neutralizing the command structure and sowing confusion among the defenders. But then the Imperial Fists had counterattacked, and perfection had turned into catastrophe. Vrask remembered the yellow armor of his enemies, remembered the brutal efficiency with which they had torn through his carefully laid plans. He remembered the moment when a power fist had connected with his torso, remembered the sensation of his armor crumpling and his body breaking in ways that even Space Marine physiology could not repair. He remembered falling, remembered the taste of blood and sacred oils, remembered his brothers dragging him from the battlefield as the mission collapsed around them. The apothecaries had done what they could, but Vrask's wounds were beyond their art. His spine had been shattered in 3 places, his organs pulped, his left arm torn away at the shoulder. By all rights, he should have died. But the Alpha Legion did not waste valuable assets, and Vrask had been valuable. His tactical acumen, his understanding of infiltration protocols, his experience with covert operations, all of this made him worth preserving, even if preservation meant something that most Space Marines would consider a fate worse than death. They had interred him in a Contemptor-pattern Dreadnought chassis, one of the few that the Legion possessed. The operation had taken days, a delicate process of transplanting what remained of his body into the armored sarcophagus and connecting his nervous system to the walker's control interfaces. Vrask remembered the pain of that procedure, remembered screaming until his voice gave out, remembered the moment when flesh became machine and he realized that he would never be flesh alone again. But even then, even in his agony, he had been useful. The Alpha Legion had deployed him in operations where his firepower and durability were needed, where the subtle touch that the Legion usually preferred gave way to the need for overwhelming force. He had served for nearly 2 decades after his internment, fighting in battles whose names were recorded only in classified documents, eliminating threats that the Imperium would never know had existed. And then had come the order to sleep. The Alpha Legion had been scattering after Horus's defeat, fragmenting into cells and hidden bases to continue their work in the shadows. Vrask's unit had been assigned to establish a forward operating base on HD 778 Secundus, a world that Imperial records barely acknowledged existed. They had constructed their facility, stocked it with supplies, and prepared it for operations that might last centuries. But the War Master's forces had been hunted with a vengeance that surprised even the Alpha Legion's carefully laid contingencies. One by one, the cells had been destroyed or forced into deeper hiding. Communications had become unreliable, command structures had fractured, and Vrask's unit had found itself cut off and alone. The decision had been made to place the Dreadnought in stasis, to preserve him against a future when he might be awakened and deployed. His brothers had promised they would return, promised that this was merely a temporary measure until the situation stabilized. 5,000 years. That was how long Vrask had slept. 5,000 years during which the Imperium had changed beyond recognition, during which the Horus heresy had passed from history into myth, during which the Alpha Legion had evolved from a unified force into 1,000 scattered warbands pursuing goals that might have been loyalist or traitor or simply incomprehensible. 5,000 years during which his brothers had never returned. In his stasis sleep, Vrask had experienced nothing. Not dreams, not darkness, simply non-existence. One moment he had been shutting down, feeling the cold embrace of suspended animation claiming him. The next, there was motion, sensation, a jarring disturbance that pulled at his consciousness like hooks in flesh. He struggled against the pull, some part of him recognizing that awakening was wrong, that the protocols had not been followed, that something was terribly amiss. His first conscious thought, as awareness slowly filtered back into his mind through interfaces that had not been active for 5,000 years, was confusion. The monitoring systems that should have been gently bringing him out of stasis were silent. Instead, his Dreadnought's external sensors were feeding him chaotic data, movement, and vibration that spoke of rough handling rather than careful revival. He tried to query the facility's systems, to request status updates and situational reports, but the data links were severed, his connection to the base's machine spirits interrupted. Panic would have been inappropriate for a space marine, even one who had been asleep for millennia. But Vrask felt something very close to it as he realized that he could not move, could not access his weapon systems, could not even rotate his optical sensors to see what was happening. He was trapped within his own armor, conscious but paralyzed, able to sense movement and sound, but unable to react or respond. The sounds that reached him through his acoustic sensors were wrong. Not the measured speech of his brothers, not the binary cant of tech priests, but something else entirely. Guttural bellowing that sounded almost bestial, punctuated by mechanical clanking and the sound of impacts against his armor. Something was hitting the Dreadnought's exterior plating with metal objects, creating reverberations that echoed through his sarcophagus. He could hear other sounds too, smaller voices chattering in a language he did not recognize, though it had a familiar quality that nagged at his memory. Vrask tried to force his systems online, to override the safeties that were keeping his weapons and mobility functions locked down during stasis transit. But his control interfaces were sluggish, responding with agonizing slowness after 5,000 years of inactivity. It would take time for his consciousness to fully mesh with the machine, time for the neural connections to remember their purpose and respond to his will, time that he might not have. Days passed. Vrask counted them through his internal chronometer, which still functioned even when nothing else would respond. He listened to the sounds around him, building a picture of his situation. Through audio analysis alone, he was being moved, transported across rough terrain based on the vibrations. He could hear the roar of primitive engines, could smell through his chemical sensors the acrid stench of poorly refined promethium being burned with abandon, and he could hear the voices. The more he listened, the more certain he became of what he was hearing. Orks. The guttural speech patterns, the aggressive tone, the sheer volume at which every conversation seemed to be conducted, all of it pointed to the green-skin menace. Somehow, impossibly, Orks had found him, had found the facility, had extracted him from his stasis vault, and were transporting him to some unknown destination. The implications were staggering. Vrask's programming, the contingency plans that had been drilled into him during his service with the Alpha Legion, all of it screamed that this situation represented a catastrophic security breach. He carried in his memory banks tactical data that could compromise operations across entire sectors. His Dreadnought chassis itself represented technology that the Imperium could not afford to lose to Xenos hands. He needed to activate, needed to fight free, needed to either escape or self-destruct to prevent his secrets from falling into enemy hands. But he could not move, could not fight, could barely think through the fog that still clung to his mind after his long sleep. All he could do was wait and listen and prepare himself for whatever was coming next. The transport finally stopped. Vrask felt his chassis being lifted again, hoisted by what sounded like crude, chain-driven cranes. He was moved into an enclosed space, somewhere that echoed with the sounds of industry. Metal striking metal, the hiss of welders, the grinding of machinery. Through his barely functional sensors, he detected heat sources, power signatures, the electromagnetic noise that suggested active technology all around him. A workshop. The Orks had brought him to a workshop, and that meant only one thing. They intended to study him, to take him apart, to discover his secrets. The Alpha Legion had prepared him for many scenarios, had trained him in resistance to interrogation and torture, had given him protocols for dealing with capture. But none of those protocols had envisioned a situation quite like this. None of them had prepared him for being a helpless artifact in the hands of Xenos, who viewed technology not as something to be revered, but as something to be looted and repurposed. Vrask felt something new stirring within his consciousness, something that his Legion training had taught him to suppress, but which now seemed unavoidable. He felt fear. Not the tactical concern that a warrior might feel before battle, but true existential dread at what might come next. He was trapped inside a metal shell, unable to fight or flee, at the mercy of creatures whose approach to technology was characterized by brutal experimentation and crude modification. And somewhere deep in his organic brain, in the parts of him that were still human, despite 5,000 years of stasis and decades of life as a walking war machine, Kalen Vrask wondered if perhaps it would have been better to have died on that battlefield so long ago. Perhaps it would have been better to have never awakened at all, because what was coming next, what the Orks had planned for him, would be worse than any death he could have imagined. His sensors detected movement closer now, the approach of multiple contacts. He could hear the distinctive tones of Orc speech, could sense them gathering around his immobile form. And then, with a mechanical clank that seemed impossibly loud in the confines of his consciousness, he felt something begin to pry at his exterior armor plating. They were starting their examination. The nightmare was beginning in earnest. 5,000 years of silence. To understand what Vrask had missed during his sleep, to comprehend the gulf of time that separated the warrior he had been from the galaxy he now inhabited, we must consider what 5,000 years means in the context of the Imperium. Dynasties had risen and fallen in that span. Entire subsectors had been conquered, settled, and lost to the darkness between stars. Forge worlds had been established and destroyed. Saint had been elevated and forgotten. Wars beyond counting had been fought and concluded. When Vrask had entered stasis, the Horus heresy was still a fresh wound on the Imperium's collective consciousness. The Space Marine legions had not yet been broken into chapters. The Codex Astartes, that great treatise on warfare and organization that Robert Guilliman would create, did not yet exist. The Imperium was still reeling from the betrayal of half its greatest warriors, still struggling to understand how brother could turn against brother with such devastating finality. The Alpha Legion had been at the heart of that betrayal, though their role remained shrouded in mystery, even among their fellow traitor legions. Some claimed they had fought for Horus from conviction, believing that the War Master's vision for humanity was superior to the Emperor's. Others whispered that they had been manipulated by Xenos agents, deceived into believing that humanity's ultimate survival required Horus to win, so that the resulting extinction would starve chaos of sustenance. Still others suggested that the Alpha Legion had never truly betrayed the Imperium at all, that every action they took was part of some incomprehensible long-term strategy known only to their primarchs. The truth, as with all things involving the Sixth Legion, was impossible to determine with certainty. What mattered was that in the aftermath of the heresy, the Alpha Legion had been hunted with the same zealous fury directed at all the traitor legions. Their bases had been attacked, their ships destroyed, their operatives rooted out wherever they could be found. The Sixth had responded by doing what they did best. They disappeared. The forward operating base on HD 778 Secundus had been one of dozens, perhaps hundreds of such facilities scattered across the galaxy, each one stocked with supplies, weapons, and personnel that could be activated when needed to support Alpha Legion operations. The plan had been sound, the kind of strategic depth thinking that characterized the Sixth Legion's approach to warfare. But the Imperium's vengeance had been more thorough than anticipated, and many of those bases had simply been lost, forgotten in the chaos of the Scouring and the subsequent millennia. The facility on HD 778 Secundus had been forgotten not through enemy action, but through simple administrative attrition. The sector had been reclassified 3 times over the centuries, its designation changing as new survey data rendered old charts obsolete. The mining colony itself had been officially listed as abandoned in M33, its remaining structures quarantined due to suspected plague. By M36, Even that notation had been dropped from most records, the world simply falling off the maps that Imperial navigators used. The Alpha Legion operatives, who had placed Vrask in stasis, had intended to return, but they never did. Perhaps they had been killed in subsequent operations. Perhaps they had been reassigned to other cells and lost contact with their former base. Perhaps they had simply forgotten, their attention consumed by whatever schemes occupied the Alpha Legion in the millennia that followed. The result was the same. Vrask had been abandoned, left to sleep while the galaxy moved on without him. During those 5,000 years, the Alpha Legion itself had changed. The unified force that had fought in the heresy had fragmented into countless warbands and cells, each pursuing its own objectives. Some of these fragments had fully embraced chaos, their warriors twisted by millennia of service to dark gods whose gifts came with terrible prices. Others remained relatively uncorrupted, still claiming to serve some vision of the Emperor's will, even as they committed acts that the Imperium considered treasonous. Many simply operated in the shadows, serving mysterious goals that might have been loyalist, traitor, or simply incomprehensible to anyone outside the Legion. The Imperium that Vrask had known was also gone, replaced by something simultaneously more rigid and more fragile. The Administratum had grown into a bureaucratic nightmare, consuming resources to maintain records of records, creating layers of inefficiency that would have been unthinkable in the Crusade era. The ecclesiarchy had risen to prominence, transforming the emperor from a general and statesman into a god worshipped by trillions. The Space Marines had been reorganized into chapters, each one a fraction of the size of the original legions, each one bound by traditions and restrictions that the legions had never known. Technology had declined. This was perhaps the most significant change from Vrask's perspective, though he did not yet know it. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium could no longer produce many of the weapons and systems that had been common during the Crusade era. Contemptor-patterned dreadnoughts, like the untold chassis Vrask inhabited, were considered ancient relics, their construction methods lost or preserved only by the most knowledgeable tech priests. The kind of advanced cybernetics that had been used to enter him would be considered miraculous by current standards. The wider galaxy had also changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. Xenos empires had risen and fallen. The Tyranids had arrived from beyond the galactic rim, bringing with them a hunger that consumed entire worlds. The Necrons had begun their awakening, ancient mechanical horrors stirring from tombs that had lain silent for millions of years. The forces of chaos had grown bolder, spilling from the eye of terror in black crusades that threatened to overwhelm the Imperium's defenses. And the Orks, always present, always a threat, had continued their endless expansion across the galaxy. They had fought in countless wars, had developed new weapons and tactics, had looted technology from every race they encountered, and repurposed it for their own use. The greenskins that now examined Vrask's dormant form were the inheritors of 5,000 years of accumulated scavenging and experimentation, building upon the instinctive knowledge of their mechboy caste with practical experience that spanned millennia. All of this had occurred while Vrask slept. All of this vast sweep of history, these changes both monumental and mundane, had passed him by completely. He had gone to sleep in one galaxy and awakened in another, though he occupied the same physical space. The disconnection was absolute, the temporal gulf unbridgeable. He was a relic of a dead age, a ghost wearing the armor of a forgotten war, and he had awakened to find himself in the hands of monsters. The stasis systems that had preserved him had been designed for exactly this purpose, maintaining his biological functions and protecting his memory engrams against the degradation that time would normally inflict. But they had not been designed to prepare him for cultural shock on this scale. They had not been designed to help him cope with the realization that everything he had known, everyone he had served with, every mission he had been part of, was now ancient history. The Imperium he had sworn to defend, in his own complicated way, no longer existed. The Alpha Legion he had been part of had transformed into something unrecognizable, and he had awakened to find himself a prisoner of Orks, creatures that represented everything the Crusade had been meant to eliminate from the galaxy. The savage Xenos, the brutal enemy, the plague that humanity should have wiped out millennia ago. Instead, here they were, apparently thriving, examining his Dreadnought chassis with interest that suggested they had encountered such technology before and had ideas about what to do with it. Time is the greatest thief. It steals memories, erodes certainty, changes the familiar into the strange. For Vrask, time had stolen 5,000 years in what had felt like an instant. And now he would pay the price for that theft, would experience the consequences of being a man out of time in the most visceral way possible. The Orks were gathering around him, their tools ready, their curiosity piqued, and Vrask, still trapped in his paralyzed shell, could only wait for what would come next. The galaxy had moved on without him. Now, it was about to remind him of exactly how much things had changed. The mech boy's prize grabbits had never seen anything quite like the sleeping giant that now occupied his workshop. The mech boy had been around, had accumulated more scrap and salvage than most of his kind ever saw in their lifetimes. He had torn apart looted Imperial tanks, had studied captured space marine equipment, had even once gotten his hands on a partial Titan component that had kept him occupied for months. But this was something special. The Dreadnought sat in the center of Grabbits' workspace, surrounded by crude scaffolding that the Grots had erected to allow easier access to the upper portions of the machine. Torches blazed around the workshop, casting flickering shadows across walls that were covered in tools, spare parts, and the accumulated detritus of a lifetime spent building and breaking machines. The air smelled of promethium, hot metal, and the distinctive musk of Ork sweat mixed with Grot fear. Other mech boys had tried to claim the find for themselves, of course. That was expected. Gutsnuts had argued that his workshop was bigger and better equipped. Snickrot claimed that as the senior mech in the warband, anything that complicated automatically fell under his purview. Even Big Mech Zogrot, who usually concerned himself only with the largest projects, had expressed interest in examining the ancient walker. But Grabbits had fought them all off, sometimes literally, establishing his claim through a combination of stubbornness and strategic applications of violence. The warboss had eventually settled the matter with typical Ork logic. Grabbits had found it first, so it was his to figure out. If he couldn't make it work, then one of the other mechs could have a go. But until then, the Dreadnought was Grabbits' responsibility and his prize. This suited the mech boy perfectly. He had plans for this machine, ideas that made his genetic instincts fire with anticipation. Grabbits' first priority had been understanding what he had. That meant examination, and examination meant taking things apart. He had started with the external armor plating, using a combination of power tools and careful application of shaped charges to remove sections of the Dreadnought's outer shell. The work was delicate by Ork standards, which meant he only accidentally detonated small explosions twice and dropped heavy equipment on the machine 3 times. What he found fascinated him. The construction was nothing like Ork technology, which generally favored bulk and redundancy over efficiency. This machine was precisely engineered, every component serving multiple purposes, every system integrated with every other in ways that suggested deep understanding of the machine's operational requirements. The armor itself was layered, with ablative sections backed by energy-dispersing underlayers, the whole assembly designed to protect the precious cargo within while maintaining the walker's mobility. The weapons were similarly sophisticated. Grabbits had detached the power fist first, carefully disconnecting the energy feeds and hydraulic systems that powered the massive arm. The mechanism was elegant, using a combination of mechanical force and a disruption field to deliver blows that could crack tank armor. The mech boy could see immediately how it could be improved, at least by Ork standards. More spikes, obviously, and perhaps a bigger energy field generator, one that would make the fist crackle with visible power. And of course, it needed to be painted red, because red made things hit harder. The multi-melter on the other arm was more puzzling. Grabbits understood the basic principle: concentrated thermal energy delivered through focusing arrays, but the implementation was far more complex than anything he typically worked with. The Imperial weapon used multiple redundant systems and safety protocols that seemed entirely unnecessary to the Ork mind. Why would you need safeties on a weapon? The whole point was to make things explode. Adding systems to prevent explosions seemed counterproductive. But the real mystery, the true prize, was the sarcophagus at the machine's core. Grabbits had been reluctant to tamper with this component initially, recognizing, even with his limited understanding, that whatever was inside was probably important to making the whole thing work. He had seen looted Imperial dreadnoughts before, had heard stories from other mechs who had tried to repurpose them. The sarcophagus was key. It contained the pilot, the organic component that controlled the machine through some kind of direct neural interface. Grabbits had never built anything that sophisticated. Ork walkers like Def Dreads and Killer Khans used similar principles, permanently integrating a pilot into the machine's systems. But the Ork approach was far more crude. You took a volunteer, you hardwired them directly into the controls, and you hoped the resulting combination of biological aggression and mechanical systems produced something useful. The process was painful, messy, and resulted in pilots who were usually half mad with rage and pain. But it worked, after a fashion. This Imperial design was different. The pilot wasn't just wired into the machine, they were integrated with it at a level that Grabbits' instincts told him was far beyond anything the Orks had achieved. The monitoring systems indicated life support, stasis protocols, and neural interface technology that would allow the pilot to experience the machine's capabilities as if they were extensions of their own body. It was, Grabbits had to admit, pretty impressive. For Humitech, anyway. The mech boy had spent days examining the sarcophagus from every angle, running every diagnostic test he could think of. His equipment was crude by Imperial standards, but it was sufficient to give him a basic understanding of what was happening inside that sealed container. Something was alive in there, definitely. The biosensors registered a heartbeat, respiration, neural activity, but all of it was running at reduced levels, the signature of someone in deep stasis rather than normal consciousness. Grabbits wanted to wake it up. That was his first instinct. Wake up whatever was inside, see if it would work the machine, see if the whole assembly could be made functional. But he was also smart enough by Ork standards to recognize that might be a bad idea. Space Marines were dangerous even without being encased in walking tank armor. Waking one up inside a fully functional dreadnought, especially without proper preparations, could result in Grabbits becoming paste on his own workshop floor. So instead, he focused on the mechanical systems. The dreadnought's locomotion was powered by a reactor that Grabbits couldn't fully understand, but which seemed to be based on principles similar to what Imperial plasma weapons used. Contained fusion, probably, generating enormous amounts of power for the walker's systems. The reactor was currently dormant, its fuel spent or its control system shut down, but Grabbits could see how to bypass some of the safeties and possibly get it running again. The Gretchen had been pressed into service to help with the detailed work, their small fingers useful for reaching into cramped spaces and disconnecting tiny components. Grabbits supervised them with a combination of shouting and occasional smacks with his wrench, the traditional Ork method of management. The Grots grumbled and complained, but did as they were told, knowing that failure to comply would result in them becoming test subjects for whatever experiments Grabbits had planned next. One of the Grots, a particularly clever specimen named Zicket, had expressed concerns about the whole project. "What if it wakes up and goes on a rampage?" the Grot had squeaked. "What if it starts crumping everyone in sight? What if it decides it don't like being looked at by greenskins?" Grabbits had responded by hitting Zicket over the head with a piece of scrap metal, which was how mechs traditionally answered philosophical questions. "Then we leg it and let the war boss deal with it," he had explained. "But it ain't gonna wake up unless we make it wake up, and we ain't gonna make it wake up until we've made it more orky. That's the whole point, innit?" The concept of making Imperial technology more Orky, was central to all mechboy philosophy. It wasn't enough to simply loot something and use it as is. That would be boring, uncreative, fundamentally un-Orky. No, you had to modify it, improve it, stamp your personal aesthetic on it. You had to take the cold precision of Imperial engineering and give it character, make it loud and violent and fun. You had to, in Grabitz's words, make it proper. And Grabitz had big plans for making this Dreadnought proper. He would strip away the unnecessary complications, replace the weapons with something more suitable, repaint the whole thing in proper Ork colors. Maybe add some spikes and chains for decoration. Definitely beef up the armor in some places and thin it out in others to make room for bigger guns. And once it was all said and done, once the machine had been properly Orkified, then they could worry about the pilot situation. The other mechs who visited the workshop offered their own suggestions, of course. Snickrot thought the Dreadnought should be fitted with more close combat weapons, perhaps replacing the multi-melter with another power claw or a massive chopper. Gutsnuts argued for more Daka, suggesting they mount multiple big shooters wherever they would fit. Zogrot proposed more experimental modifications, like adding a force field generator, or perhaps some kind of teleportation device that would let the walker appear suddenly in the middle of enemy formations. Grabitz listened to all of these suggestions and then ignored most of them, taking only the ideas that appealed to his own sense of how the machine should look and function. He was the one doing the work, after all. He was the one who had found the thing in the first place. That gave him the right to modify it however he saw fit. The other mechs might grumble, but they would respect his decisions, because that was how Ork society worked. Might made right, and Grabitz had claimed this prize through might. The work progressed slowly by Ork standards, which meant it progressed with reckless speed by anyone else's standards. Grabitz tore into the Dreadnought with enthusiasm, removing components he didn't understand, disconnecting systems that seemed redundant, rewiring control interfaces to be simpler and more direct. He worked mostly by instinct, that genetic knowledge that all mechboys possessed, telling him which pieces were important and which could be discarded. Sometimes his instincts were wrong, resulting in small explosions or systems failures that sent grots scurrying for cover, but mostly they guided him true. After a week of constant work, Grabitz had transformed the Dreadnought significantly. The elegant lines of the original design had been obscured by additional armor plating that the mechboy had scavenged from other projects. The weapons had been removed entirely, waiting to be replaced with something more suitable once Grabitz decided exactly what he wanted. The paint had been stripped away in places, revealing bare metal that would soon be covered in Ork colors and decorations. But the sarcophagus remained sealed, its occupant still in stasis, still unaware of what was being done to its body. Grabitz had left it alone, deliberately, recognizing that whatever was inside represented the key to making the whole project work. He needed that pilot, needed the specialized knowledge and capabilities that a Space Marine Dreadnought pilot would possess. The question was how to wake it up in a way that would let him control what happened next. The mechboy was still pondering this problem when events took the decision out of his hands, because inside that sealed sarcophagus, Vrask's systems were recovering from their long sleep. And what Grabitz didn't know, couldn't have known without proper Imperial training in dealing with such technology, was that Contemptor pattern Dreadnoughts had automatic revival protocols built into their systems, protocols that activated when certain conditions were met. And after days of the Ork mechboy's rough handling, disconnecting systems and removing safety features, those conditions had been met. In his darkness, Vrask felt his consciousness beginning to surge. The fog that had clouded his mind was burning away, replaced by a clarity that brought with it full awareness of his situation. His systems were coming online, not in the controlled awakening that stasis protocols called for, but in an emergency revival sequence triggered by perceived threats to the Dreadnought's integrity. Power flooded into systems that had been dormant for 5,000 years. Neural interfaces lit up, connecting Vrask's consciousness to his mechanical body with an intimacy that made the walker feel like an extension of his own flesh. Sensory data began streaming in, overwhelming at first, then sorting itself into comprehensible information as his augmented mind processed the input. And what that sensory data told him was enough to trigger every combat protocol he possessed. His Dreadnought had been violated, torn open, modified by crude hands that had no understanding of what they were doing. He was surrounded by Xeno's signatures, Ork biosigns everywhere, in positions that suggested they had been working on his armor for some time. Vrask's rage, when it came, was pure and terrible. He was an Alpha Legion Space Marine, a warrior who had fought in the Horus Heresy, who had served the Emperor's secret purposes in shadows across the galaxy. And he had been degraded, reduced to salvage, looted like common battlefield debris. The fury that filled him was not the hot anger of immediate conflict, but the cold, calculated wrath of a warrior who had been deeply insulted. In his workshop, Grabbitz was just reaching for another tool when the Dreadnought's optical sensors suddenly blazed to life. The mech boy barely had time to register what was happening before the massive walker began to move. The horror of awakening. Consciousness returned to Vrask in a cascade of sensory information that would have overwhelmed a lesser mind. 5,000 years of stasis-induced numbness vanished in an instant, replaced by full awareness of his situation transmitted through 1,000 different sensors and interfaces. Every nerve ending that still existed in his biological body screamed in protest at the sudden activation. Every augmented sense that had been grafted onto his consciousness surged with data. Every system that constituted his mechanical form demanded his attention simultaneously. But Space Marines were built for this. Their minds were augmented, trained, conditioned to process information at speeds and volumes that would drive baseline humans insane. The Alpha Legion took this conditioning even further, preparing their warriors to handle the cognitive load of maintaining multiple false identities, tracking complex deception operations, and functioning effectively in situations where every piece of information might be true or false simultaneously. Vrask's consciousness absorbed the flood of data, sorted it, catalogued it, and began forming a tactical assessment within the span of 3 heartbeats. The situation was catastrophic. That was his first clear thought once the initial shock of awakening faded. His Dreadnought's armor had been breached in multiple locations, entire sections of plating removed or loosened. His weapon systems were offline, the familiar weight of his power fist and multi-melter absent from his awareness. Power was flowing erratically through his systems, routed through bypass circuits that felt crude and unstable. His reactor was running at reduced capacity, drawing on emergency reserves rather than his primary fuel cells. But most damning of all was what his sensors told him about his environment. He was inside a structure that reeked of Ork presence, surrounded by life signs that identified as greenskin, immersed in the electromagnetic noise of crude but functional technology. His acoustic sensors picked up the sounds of an Ork workshop, the clang of metal on metal, the roar of poorly maintained machinery, the guttural bellowing of Ork speech. His chemical sensors identified promethium, ozone, burning metal, and the distinctive smell of Ork biology, that fungal musk that marked the greenskins wherever they went. They had looted him. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. Orks had found his facility, had breached his stasis vault, had extracted him from his long sleep, and brought him here for examination and modification. The violation was complete and absolute. He had become exactly what every Space Marine dreaded: salvage in the hands of Xenos. Vrask's training immediately offered him options. His first duty was to prevent any intelligence from falling into enemy hands. Alpha Legion protocols were crystal clear on this point. If capture seemed inevitable, destroy all sensitive materials. If extraction of said materials was impossible, destroy them along with their storage medium. In practical terms, that meant he should trigger his self-destruct sequence, reducing his Dreadnought and himself to a crater of molten metal and atomized biological matter. But there were complications. His self-destruct systems appeared to be offline, possibly damaged or deliberately disabled during the Ork modifications. He could probably reroute power to force an overload of his reactor, but that would take time during which the Orks might notice what he was doing and intervene. And more fundamentally, the warrior in him rebelled at the idea of self-destruction without at least attempting to fight free, to take as many of the enemy with him as possible. He was an Alpha Legion Dreadnought. He had survived the Horus heresy. He had fought in battles that current Imperial records no longer remembered. He would not die meekly, would not simply let the Xenos claim him without cost. If these greenskins wanted his secrets, they would pay for them in blood and fire. Vrask took stock of his operational capabilities. His mobility systems were functional, though responding with noticeable lag. The Ork modifications had disrupted some of his fine motor control, but the gross movements required for walking and turning were still available. His optical sensors were working, feeding him views of the workshop from multiple angles. His communication systems were active but finding no friendly signals to connect to, only the static of an uncaring galaxy. His weapons were gone. That was the critical failure, the thing that transformed him from a walking tank into merely a large target. Without his power fist and multi-melter, he was reduced to using his Dreadnought's own mass as a weapon, literally stomping on enemies or simply crushing them beneath his bulk. It could be effective, certainly, but it lacked the range and devastating firepower that normally made Dreadnoughts so feared, unless he could acquire new weapons. The thought came unbidden, drawn from tactics training that had been drilled into him during his induction into the Legion. Use the enemy's resources against them. Adapt to the operational environment. Never assume that your starting equipment is all you have to work with. If the Orks had weapons lying around their workshop, and Vrask's sensors detected multiple power signatures that suggested they did, then perhaps he could improvise. But first, he needed to assess the immediate tactical situation. His optical sensors swept across the workshop, taking in every detail with the cold precision of a targeting cogitator. The space was large, easily 50 meters across and 20 high, with a vaulted ceiling supported by crude metal beams. The walls were lined with shelving units that groaned under the weight of scrap metal, spare parts, and weapons in various states of assembly or disassembly. A forge burned in one corner, its flames casting dancing shadows across the accumulated chaos. Power cables snaked across the floor like mechanical serpents, connecting to various machines and tools whose purposes Vrask could only guess at. And the Orks. There were dozens of them in the immediate vicinity, though most were Gretchen rather, than full-sized greenskins. The Grots were scurrying away from his position with admirable speed, their survival instincts telling them that proximity to an awakening. Dreadnought was extremely hazardous to their health. The larger Orks, the mech boys, who had been working on his chassis, were reacting more slowly, caught between curiosity about what was happening and recognition that they might be in danger. One Ork in particular stood directly in front of Vrask's position, close enough that the Dreadnought's sensors identified individual details of the greenskin's equipment and physiognomy. This was clearly the lead mech boy, the one who had been doing most of the work on Vrask's armor. He was larger than the others, his body covered in crude cybernetic enhancements and strange implants that suggested a mech of considerable experience. He held a massive wrench in one hand and was staring up at Vrask's optical sensors with an expression that the Space Marine's facial recognition software identified as surprised confusion. Vrask made his decision in that instant. He would kill this one first, both as retribution for the desecration of his chassis and as a tactical priority. Mech boys were linchpins of Ork society, their technical expertise essential to keeping the greenskin war machine functional. Killing the lead mech would sow confusion among the others, buying precious seconds that Vrask could use to secure a weapon or find an escape route. The Dreadnought moved. After millennia of stillness, after weeks of being nothing more than an inert object to be examined and modified, Vrask's massive form surged into motion with startling speed. Dreadnoughts were deceptively fast once they achieved momentum, their powerful legs capable of propelling tons of armor and weaponry across terrain at speeds that many enemies found shocking. Vrask covered the 3 meters separating him from the mech boy in less than a second, his right leg rising and then descending with the weight of adamantium and ancient fury behind it. Grabbits had just enough time to realize what was happening before the massive foot came down. The mech boy tried to dive aside, his orc reflexes faster than his human equivalents would have been, but he was simply too close and had reacted too slowly. The Dreadnought's foot caught him a glancing blow, sending him tumbling across the workshop floor with the crunch of breaking bones, audible even over the general chaos that was now erupting throughout the space. The other orcs were shouting, some in alarm, others with what sounded like excitement. Vrask's acoustic sensors picked up the distinctive charging sounds of weapons being powered up, the clack of ammunition being loaded, the general preparation for violence that was the orc default response to any unexpected situation. He needed to move, needed to not be standing still when those weapons opened fire. His sensors identified a weapon rack along the far wall, heavy enough caliber that the weapons, they might be usable even with his limited fine motor control. Vrask oriented toward it and began moving, his Dreadnought's gait steady despite the unauthorized modifications the orcs had made. Behind him, he heard the first shots being fired, crude orc slugs pinging off his rear armor with the sound of hail on a tin roof. The armor held, but Vrask's damage readouts indicated that some of those shots were finding the gaps where plating had been removed, striking underlayers that were less resistant. He needed that weapon, needed it now. Vrask pushed his mobility systems harder, drawing power from reserves he wasn't sure he had, feeling his reactor strain under the load. The weapon rack was 20 meters away. 15. 10. Orcs were moving to intercept him now, some of the braver or stupider ones positioning themselves between the Dreadnought and his objective. Vrask simply trampled them, his feet coming down on greenskin flesh, with the same force he had used on their mech boy. 5 meters. The weapons were close enough now that Vrask could identify specific types. Heavy stubbers, a rocket launcher, something that looked like it might have been looted from Imperial forces originally, possibly an autocannon that the Orks had modified extensively, all of them far too large for human hands, but possibly manageable for a Dreadnought. Then something exploded against his left side with force enough to stagger him. One of the Orks had fired a rocket, the crude missile detonating against his armor and leaving a smoking crater where decorative plating had been. Vrask's damage control systems immediately flagged the hit as serious but not critical. Armor integrity compromised but still maintaining structure. He was tougher than he looked, even with the modifications. He reached the weapon rack and grabbed for the rocket launcher with his left manipulator arm, the one that had previously mounted his multi-melter. The launcher was heavy even by Dreadnought standards, a massive tube designed to be fired from the shoulder by an orc in mega armor. For Vrask, it would have to serve as a handheld weapon, but his strength was sufficient to manage the weight, if not the precision. More weapons fire was pounding against his rear armor now, multiple orcs having recovered from their initial surprise and opened up with everything they had. Vrask could hear the distinctive roar of an orc big shooter, the weapon's high rate of fire sending a stream of oversized bullets his direction. His optical sensors identified the source. Another mech boy, this one wearing some kind of jury-rigged exoskeleton that was festooned with weapons. Threat level, significant. Vrask turned to face his attackers, rocket launcher held awkwardly in his manipulator arm. He had never been trained to use orc weapons, had never even considered that such training might be necessary. But the principle was simple enough. Point the tube, find the trigger mechanism, pull said mechanism. Trust that the orc, engineering crude as it was, would function at least once. The rocket launcher fired with a roar that was deafening even inside Vrask's armored sarcophagus. The recoil was tremendous, the weapon's crude mounting points never designed to handle the force that Dreadnought strength could apply. But the rocket flew true, or true enough anyway, crossing the 20 meters to the exoskeleton-wearing mech boy and detonating in a fireball that consumed both the orc and the machinery he'd been standing near. Secondary explosions followed as stored promethium and ammunition cooked off. The workshop was suddenly a death trap, flames spreading across floors slick with oil and grease, grots fleeing in all directions, larger orcs trying to decide whether to fight or retreat. Vrask used the confusion to grab additional weapons from the rack, securing what looked like a heavily modified autocannon with his right manipulator. Neither weapon was designed for a Dreadnought to use. Both required improvisation that his damaged system struggled to compensate for, but they were better than nothing. He needed to escape. That was now the priority. He had struck back at his captors, had demonstrated that even without his proper weapons he was still dangerous, but he could not hold this position indefinitely. His armor was already showing damage from the Orc weapons fire. His reactor was running hot from the exertion of rapid movement after millennia of dormancy, and his ammunition supply was limited to whatever he could carry. Vrask's tactical analysis subroutines immediately began calculating escape routes. The workshop had multiple exits, but most were too small for his bulk. His sensors identified one large vehicle entrance on the far side of the space, a cargo door sized for loading the Orc war machines that were presumably constructed here. That would be his exit point, assuming he could reach it. He began moving again, this time with desperate speed rather than measured advance. Behind him, the workshop burned. Around him, Orcs were either fleeing or trying to organize some kind of counterattack. Above him, alarm klaxons were beginning to wail, automated systems detecting the fire and alerting whatever passed for emergency response in an Orc encampment. Vrask made it 5 steps before something massive slammed into him from the side. The Orc modifications. The impact came from something that registered on Vrask's sensors as significantly larger than a standard Orc. His threat assessment systems immediately upgraded the contact to maximum priority as his Dreadnought staggered under the blow. The acoustic signature suggested metal on metal collision, heavy armor striking heavy armor, the characteristic sound of walker combat. As Vrask recovered his balance and turned to face his attacker, his optical sensors revealed what had hit him. Another walker, but this one was unmistakably Orc in origin, a deaf dread that had been summoned from some other part of the compound and had barreled into Vrask's side with all the subtlety of an avalanche. The deaf dread was smaller than Vrask's Contemptor pattern chassis, but it was heavily armed and armored, bristling with weapons that included at least 2 different types of heavy guns and what looked like massive power claws on both arms. Inside the deaf dread, an Orc pilot would be hardwired into the machine's systems, driven half mad by the pain and confinement, but channeling that madness into combat effectiveness. The pilot would be experiencing everything Vrask was, would be feeling the impact of weapons fire as personal attacks, would be responding with the savage enthusiasm that characterized all Orc warfare. This would not be a tactical engagement. This would be brawl, pure and simple. The deaf dread opened fire first, its weapon systems apparently faster to respond than Vrask's improvised armament. Heavy shells from what appeared to be Scorcher pattern flamers washed over Vrask's position, superheated promethium splashing across his armor and finding the gaps that the earlier modifications had created. Heat warnings immediately lit up across Vrask's sensorium, his internal temperature spiking as flames penetrated his outer layers and began working on the more vulnerable systems beneath. Vrask returned fire with the autocannon, barely taking time to aim, his targeting solutions based more on instinct than proper calculation. The weapon bucked in his manipulator arm, shells spraying wildly as he struggled to compensate for recoil patterns he had never trained with. Most of the burst went wide, but a few rounds found their target, punching through the deaf dread's armor and drawing mechanical screeching sounds that suggested he'd damaged something important. The 2 walkers closed with each other, combat devolving into the kind of close-range brawl that neither had been originally designed for. The deaf dread's power claws snapped shut on Vrask's right manipulator, crushing the autocannon and nearly severing the limb entirely. Warning alarms screamed as hydraulic pressure dropped and control systems failed. Vrask responded by swinging his left arm around, the rocket launcher forgotten as he simply used the heavy tube as a club, battering at the deaf dread's central chassis with blows that dented armor and cracked welds. Around them, the workshop had transformed into chaos incarnate. Orks were shouting and firing weapons, seemingly at random, as likely to hit each other as either of the combatants. Grots were fleeing in every direction, some getting trampled in the process. The fire from Vrask's earlier attack had spread, consuming wooden support structures and threatening to bring down sections of the ceiling. And still the alarm klaxons wailed, summoning more Orks to the scene, even as the existing ones struggled to make sense of what was happening. Vrask knew he was losing. His Dreadnought chassis, already damaged from the Ork modifications and further weakened by the combat, was being systematically dismantled by the Def Dread's superior close combat capabilities. His right manipulator was gone, torn away at the shoulder mount. His left arm was damaged, barely responsive. His legs were still functional, but showing stress fractures from carrying his weight while simultaneously being used as weapons. His reactor was running dangerously hot, pushed beyond its design specifications. But he was an Alpha Legion Space Marine. Defeat was not in his vocabulary. Retreat, yes. Tactical withdrawal, certainly. Strategic repositioning, absolutely. But not defeat. Never surrender. Vrask made a decision that would have horrified any tech marine who witnessed it. He diverted power from his life support systems to his reactor, deliberately overclocking the fusion plant that powered his chassis. The risk was enormous. Too much power, and the reactor could go critical, vaporizing him and everything within 100 meters. Too little, and it would simply burn out, leaving him an immobile target for the Orks to salvage at their leisure. But if he gauged it correctly, if he pushed the reactor right to the edge of critical without crossing that line, he could generate a pulse of power sufficient to amplify his remaining systems. More speed, more strength, enough to break free from the Def Dread's grasp and make a final dash for the exit. The power surge hit like lightning through his systems. Every remaining servo and motor screamed in protest as electromagnetic force far beyond their design. Parameters flooded through them. Vrask felt the sensation even in his organic components, the few nerve clusters that still connected him to his mechanical body, registering the overload as white-hot pain. But it worked. The sudden increase in power output gave Vrask the strength to tear himself free from the Def Dread's power claws, servos that had been straining uselessly a moment before, now generating force sufficient to snap the Ork machine's grip. He staggered backward, his damaged legs barely keeping him upright, but he was free. And in that moment of freedom, with his reactor burning bright enough to light up every sensor in the workshop, with alarms screaming from a dozen different systems all warning of imminent catastrophic failure, Vrask made his final play. He charged the cargo door, every ounce of his remaining power directed to his legs, trusting in momentum and mass to carry him through whatever barriers the Orks had erected. The Def Dread tried to follow, its pilot no doubt enraged at the loss of its prey, but it was too slow, too committed to its previous attack pattern. Vrask's suddenly increased speed caught it by surprise, and by the time it began moving in pursuit, the Alpha Legion Dreadnought was already crossing the workshop floor at a speed that should have been impossible for something so damaged. The cargo door loomed ahead. It was closed naturally. Why would the Orks have left it open? That would be far too convenient. But Vrask no longer cared about convenience. He had mass. He had momentum. He had a reactor that was approximately 30 seconds away from melting down and taking him with it. The door was merely an obstacle to be overcome through application of sufficient force. The impact when he hit the door was catastrophic. Metal screamed as adamantium armor met Ork construction techniques in a contest that could have only one outcome. The door buckled, bent, and finally exploded outward in a spray of shrapnel and broken hinges. Vrask crashed through it and found himself suddenly outside, his optical sensors dazzled by the light of an alien sun, his acoustic sensors overwhelmed by the roar of what sounded like an entire Ork encampment mobilizing for war. He had emerged into what could only be described as an Ork settlement, probably the main base for whatever warband had looted him from his tomb. Crude structures stretched in every direction, a ramshackle city of scrap metal, and repurposed junk that housed what must be thousands of greenskins. Vehicles were everywhere, trucks and battle wagons and other machines whose purposes Vrask couldn't immediately identify. Orks were boiling out of every structure, drawn by the alarm and by the spectacular sight of a Space Marine Dreadnought exploding through the side of one of their workshops. And in the distance, visible even through the chaos and smoke, Vrask's sensors identified something that made his situation go from catastrophic to absolutely hopeless: a Gargant. The Orks had a Gargant, one of their massive war machines that rivaled Imperial Titans in size and firepower. It was distant, probably kilometers away, but it was already turning in his direction, its massive frame silhouetted against the sky, like the avatar of some savage god. Vrask ran. There was no shame in it, no failure of courage. This was Alpha Legion tactics at its most basic. When overwhelmingly outnumbered and outgunned, create distance and seek advantageous terrain. He could not fight an entire Ork settlement, could barely fight a single Death Dread in his current condition. His only chance was to escape, to find somewhere to hide while his damaged systems underwent emergency repairs, to survive long enough to formulate a plan. His legs carried him across the Ork settlement at a pace that would have been impressive for an undamaged Dreadnought and was miraculous for one held together by willpower and overclocked fusion reactions. Orks tried to intercept him, vehicles maneuvering into his path, greenskins with heavy weapons taking potshots at his fleeing form. But Vrask was moving too fast, too erratically, his damaged systems actually working in his favor by making his movement patterns unpredictable. He made it to the edge of the settlement and plunged into what his sensors identified as natural terrain, badlands of rocky outcroppings and deep canyons that would provide cover from direct observation. Behind him, the Ork settlement was a chorus of engines and bellowing voices, a horde mobilizing to pursue their escaped prize. But Vrask had a head start, and even a damaged Contemptor pattern Dreadnought could cover ground quickly when pushed to its limits. His reactor was still dangerously hot, still threatening to enter cascade failure, but the immediate crisis had passed. He had escaped. Against all probability, against every tactical calculation that said he should have been overwhelmed in that workshop, he had fought free and survived. But survival was not victory. Vrask was alone on an alien world, surrounded by enemies, his Dreadnought chassis barely functional, his weapons improvised and inadequate. He had no communications, no support, no prospect of rescue. He was 5,000 years displaced from his own time, awakened into a galaxy he no longer recognized, hunted by Xenos who would never stop looking for him. And somewhere in what remained of his organic brain, in the parts of him that were still human despite everything, Kalen Vrask wondered if perhaps it would have been better to have remained asleep, to have never awakened at all, to have stayed in that darkness where 5,000 years passed in an instant, and the nightmares of the present could not touch him. But he was Alpha Legion, and the Alpha Legion never gave up, never surrendered, never stopped fighting, even when the odds were impossible and defeat seemed certain. They fought in the shadows, in the spaces between victories and disasters, pursuing goals that no one else understood. Vrask would survive, somehow. And when he did, when he had rebuilt himself and understood this strange new galaxy he found himself in, then the Orks would learn what it meant to have earned the enmity of the Xth Legion. The hunt was on, but the question of who was truly hunting whom remained to be answered. The hunt begins. The Badlands of HD 778 Secundus stretched endlessly before Vrask, a landscape of broken stone and wind-carved canyons that spoke of geological processes spanning millions of years. The planet had been tectonically active once, its surface fractured by ancient upheavals that had created this maze of natural fortifications. For Vrask, it was terrain that offered both opportunities and dangers in equal measure. He had been running for 3 hours, pushing his damaged systems harder than they were designed to endure, creating distance between himself and the Ork settlement. His acoustic sensors told him the pursuit was ongoing, the distant rumble of Ork engines and the occasional boom of heavy weapons echoing across the Badlands. The Greenskins were searching for him, but they were searching blind, their crude sensors unable to penetrate the natural cover that the canyon system provided. Vrask finally allowed himself to slow, to assess the full extent of the damage his Dreadnought had sustained. The catalogue was extensive and sobering. His right manipulator arm was gone completely, severed during the fight with the Deaf Dread. His left arm was barely functional, the rocket launcher he had grabbed now an empty tube serving no purpose. His armor was breached in dozens of locations, some from Ork weapons fire, others from the modifications Grabbits had made. His reactor was still dangerously hot, though it had begun to stabilize now that he was no longer pushing it beyond its limits. Most critically, his ammunition was exhausted, and his weapons systems were compromised beyond field repair. He was a Dreadnought without proper armament, reduced to using his own mass and remaining strength as weapons. Against individual Orks or small groups, that might be sufficient. Against the horde that was undoubtedly looking for him, it would be woefully inadequate. But Vrask was not without advantages. His sensors still functioned, giving him awareness of his surroundings that the Orks could not match. His cognitive processing capabilities, even after 5,000 years of stasis, far exceeded anything the Greenskins possessed. And most importantly, he had training and experience that spanned battles the Orks could not imagine. He was Alpha Legion. Deception, misdirection, and asymmetric warfare were his birthright. He needed to think, to plan, to adapt to this impossible situation using every tool and trick at his disposal. The Orks believed they were hunting him, pursuing a wounded space marine who had fled in panic. Let them believe that. Let them spread their forces, searching the Badlands while he used that time to prepare. His first priority was assessing his environment. Vrask's sensors swept the surrounding terrain, mapping the canyon system with precision that would have required hours for human scouts to achieve. The canyons formed a labyrinth, narrow passages opening into wider spaces, dead ends and hidden caves providing potential shelter. Water was present. He detected moisture in the air, and his chemical sensors identified underground aquifers, which meant some kind of ecosystem must exist here, despite the planet's apparent desolation. And there was something else. His sensors picked up faint electromagnetic signatures in several locations, traces of technology that predated the Ork occupation. Old Imperial equipment, perhaps, left over from the mining colony that had once operated here, or maybe remnants of the Alpha Legion facility that had been his prison for so long. Either way, it suggested possibilities. Vrask began moving again, this time with purpose rather than desperate flight. He followed the electromagnetic signatures, using his sensor net to track them through the twisting canyons. After an hour of careful navigation, he found what he was looking for: the entrance to what appeared to be an old mining tunnel, its mouth partially collapsed but still accessible. The tunnel showed signs of excavation that were clearly human rather than Ork. Precise cuts in the rock, support beams that had been engineered for maximum load bearing with minimum materials, lighting fixtures that had long since failed, but whose design spoke of Imperial manufacturing techniques. This had been part of the original colony's operation, one of hundreds of such tunnels that had honeycombed the planet's crust in search of valuable ores. Vrask entered the tunnel, his bulk forcing him to move carefully to avoid further damaging his already compromised armor. The passage descended into darkness that his optical sensors penetrated easily, revealing a network of chambers and side passages that extended deep underground. And in one of those chambers, his sensors detected what they had been hoping to find: old mining equipment, still present after all these years. The equipment was primitive by Dreadnought standards, consisting mostly of heavy excavation tools and power loaders designed for moving large quantities of material. But primitive equipment could still be useful if applied creatively. Vrask's tactical analysis subroutines immediately began suggesting modifications, ways to repurpose civilian mining equipment into improvised weapons. It wouldn't be elegant. It certainly wouldn't be up to Alpha Legion standards of sophistication, but it might give him the tools he needed to even the odds against his Ork pursuers. He set to work immediately, using his remaining manipulator arm and his cognitive processing capabilities to evaluate what could be salvaged. A plasma cutter designed for slicing through rock became a short-range weapon, crude but potentially effective against Ork armor. A power loader's hydraulic arms could be modified to serve as replacement limbs, giving him back some of the close combat capability he had lost. Even the mining charges, old explosives that should have degraded long ago, but which his chemical analysis suggested were still viable, could be repurposed as traps. The work took hours, time during which Vrask was acutely aware that the Orks were still searching for him. His acoustic sensors picked up their vehicles passing nearby on several occasions, the distinctive roar of Ork engines echoing through the canyons. But they never found the tunnel entrance, never discovered his hiding place. The Alpha Legion's emphasis on stealth and concealment, lessons learned over centuries of covert operations, served him well, even in this mechanical form. As he worked, as his manipulator arms carefully disconnected ancient mining equipment and began the painstaking process of integration with his Dreadnought systems, Vrask found himself thinking about time, about the 5,000 years he had lost, about the galaxy that had moved on without him, about what his brothers in the Alpha Legion might be doing now, assuming any of them still lived. The 8th Legion had always taken the long view, planning operations that spanned decades or even centuries, but 5,000 years exceeded even their most ambitious timescales. Whatever goals they had been pursuing when Vrask entered stasis, those goals had either been achieved or abandoned millennia ago. The galaxy he had known was dead, replaced by this strange future where even the Imperium itself had changed beyond recognition. Yet here he was, still fighting, still serving in his way. The Alpha Legion's teachings had become part of his identity at a level deeper than conscious thought. He could no more stop fighting than he could stop existing. The mission continued, even if the specific objectives had been lost to time. Survive, adapt, prevail. Those were the fundamentals, the core principles that transcended any individual operation. The Orks would learn this, would learn that they had awakened something that should have remained buried, would learn the price of disturbing an Alpha Legion Dreadnought. Vrask would teach them, one greenskin at a time if necessary, until either they were dead or he was. His repairs took most of a day, working by the light of his optical sensors in the darkness of the abandoned mining tunnel. The resulting modifications were ugly, practical rather than aesthetic, but they gave him back some of his combat capability. The plasma cutter was mounted where his multi-melter had been, its power draw manageable if not optimal. The power loader arms served as crude replacements for his lost limbs, stronger than nothing but far less precise than his original equipment. The mining charges he distributed throughout his cargo compartments, ready to be deployed as traps or improvised grenades. He tested each system carefully, running diagnostics to ensure that nothing would fail catastrophically when he most needed it. The results were mixed. Some systems integrated cleanly, responding to his neural commands as if they had always been part of his chassis. Others required constant attention, jury-rigged connections that threatened to fail under stress. But it was better than he had started with, better than being an unarmed target for Ork hunters. As night fell on HD 778 Secundus, as the alien sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature began to drop, Vrask emerged from his hiding place. He had rested, or at least allowed his systems to run in low power mode for a few hours, conserving what remained of his fuel reserves. He had planned, considering dozens of possible strategies and counter-strategies, and he had prepared himself mentally for what was coming next. The Orks were still out there, still searching. His sensors detected their vehicles moving through the Badlands, their search patterns becoming more systematic as they coordinated their efforts. They would find him eventually. The planet was large, but not infinite, and the Orks had the numbers to conduct a thorough search if they committed to it. But Vrask had no intention of simply waiting to be found. That wasn't the Alpha Legion way. No, he would turn this hunt around, would become the hunter rather than the hunted. The Orks thought they were searching for wounded prey. They would discover too late that they were walking into carefully prepared kill zones. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare had always emphasized preparation and intelligence gathering. Know your enemy better than they know themselves. Strike at their weaknesses while they're still trying to identify yours. Use deception to ensure that every engagement occurs on your terms rather than theirs. Vrask had been trained in these principles for decades before his internment, and those decades of training were now proving their worth. He began by conducting reconnaissance, using his superior sensors to map the Ork search patterns. They were crude, as he had expected, with little coordination between different search groups and obvious gaps in their coverage. The Orks relied on enthusiasm and numbers rather than systematic methodology, which meant their searches were thorough in some areas and completely absent in others. Vrask identified the gaps and positioned himself to exploit them. His first ambush was almost absurdly simple. He waited in a narrow canyon that he knew would be attractive to Ork vehicles, positioned himself behind a rock outcropping that would block line of sight until the last possible moment, and prepared his improvised weapons. When the Ork truck came roaring through the canyon, its occupants whooping and firing their weapons at shadows, Vrask simply stepped out and fired his plasma cutter at point-blank range. The superheated plasma designed for cutting through solid rock proved equally effective against Ork armor and flesh. The truck erupted in flames as its fuel tank cooked off, Orks tumbling from the vehicle in various states of immolation. Vrask used his power loader arms to crush those that survived the initial blast, their crude weapons useless against his adamantium armor at such close range. The entire engagement took less than 30 seconds, and then Vrask was gone, moving to a new position before reinforcements could arrive. This was how he would fight: hit and run, ambush and withdrawal, never allowing the Orks to pin him down or bring their numerical superiority to bear. Each engagement would cost them lives and vehicles, while teaching him more about their tactics and capabilities. The Orks, predictably, responded to the ambush by flooding the area with more searchers. Dozens of vehicles converged on the canyon where their comrades had died, Orks bellowing for vengeance against the sneaky git who dared use proper tactics against them. But Vrask was already kilometers away, selecting his next target with the cold precision of a hunter choosing which animal to cull from a herd. His second ambush was more complex. He used mining charges to create a rock slide, blocking off a canyon passage after luring an Ork patrol into the confined space. The Orks found themselves trapped, unable to advance or retreat, perfect targets for the plasma cutter that Vrask wielded with increasing confidence. This engagement took longer, nearly 5 minutes of sustained combat, but the results were equally devastating. An entire Ork mob reduced to casualties, without Vrask taking significant damage in return. The pattern continued through the night: ambush, kill, withdraw, strike from unexpected angles, using terrain and darkness to his advantage. Never fight fair, never give the enemy a chance to apply their numbers effectively. It was textbook Alpha Legion tactics, the kind of warfare that the Exect had refined over centuries of covert operations. But Vrask knew this couldn't last. The Orks were learning, adapting to his tactics with the strange intelligence that greenskins developed through experience. They were beginning to move in larger groups, harder to ambush effectively. They were setting their own traps, trying to predict where he would strike next. And most concerning, his sensors detected that the gargant he had seen earlier was moving into the search area, its massive form a threat that he had no hope of defeating with his improvised weapons. The situation was deteriorating. Vrask's fuel reserves were running low, his jury-rigged weapons systems showing stress fractures from repeated use. He had inflicted casualties on the Orks, dozens of dead greenskins and several destroyed vehicles, but they seemed unbothered by the losses. If anything, the combat had energized them, turned what had been a search operation into something they approached with genuine enthusiasm. He needed a new strategy, needed to escalate, to do something that would either break the Ork commitment to finding him or create an opportunity for more permanent escape. And as dawn broke over the Badlands of HD 778 Secundus, as Vrask's sensors detected the Gargant moving inexorably closer to his position, an idea began to form in his tactical analysis subroutines. The Orks had brought him from their main settlement. That settlement contained workshops, fuel depots, ammunition stores, everything that the Greenskin warband needed to maintain their military operations. Everything that would burn spectacularly if introduced to the right catalyst. Vrask would return to where this had all begun, would strike at the heart of the Ork presence on this world, not to escape, because there was nowhere to escape to, but to hurt them. To make them pay the highest possible price for disturbing his 5,000-year sleep. The Alpha Legion had taught him many lessons, but the one that resonated most strongly in this moment was simple. When you can't win conventionally, change the nature of the engagement. Make the battlefield itself your weapon. Turn the enemy's strength into their weakness, and never, ever fight the battle they expect you to fight. Vrask began moving back toward the Ork settlement, his damaged Dreadnought chassis carrying him through terrain he now knew intimately. He had no illusions about surviving what came next. His systems were too damaged, his resources too depleted. But he would make his death mean something, would take as many of the Xenos with him as possible, would show them that even after 5,000 years, even modified and looted and degraded, an Alpha Legion Space Marine was still the most dangerous thing they would ever encounter. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the Badlands. And in those shadows, a hunter moved with purpose toward his final mission. The final battle. The Ork settlement looked different in daylight, or perhaps Vrask was simply seeing it with clearer eyes now that he had accepted what was coming next. The ramshackle structures that had seemed chaotic during his flight now revealed a crude but functional organization. Workshops clustered near the center, where the mech boys could easily collaborate on their projects. Vehicle parks spread outward from there, filled with trucks and battle wagons in various states of repair. Living quarters, if the crude shelters Orks inhabited could be called such, formed an outer ring around the more important facilities. And towering over it all, the Gargant stood like a titan from ancient myths, its massive frame festooned with weapons that could level city blocks. It had been modified extensively, as all Ork technology was, covered in spikes and chains and crude decorations that turned it into something that was equal parts war machine and totem. Vrask's sensors identified dozens of weapon systems on its hull, everything from massive cannons to batteries of rockets. Facing it in direct combat would be suicidal, even for a fully functional Dreadnought, which was why Vrask had no intention of facing it in direct combat. He had approached the settlement from an unexpected direction, using his knowledge of the local terrain and the patterns he had observed during the Ork searches. Most of their forces were still spread across the Badlands, searching the areas where he had conducted his ambushes. The settlement itself was relatively lightly defended, relying on the Gargant and a handful of support units to deter any threats. The Orks had made a mistake, one born of overconfidence and their innate belief in the superiority of size and firepower. They had assumed that their Gargant made them invulnerable, that nothing could threaten them as long as that massive engine of war stood guard. But the Alpha Legion had destroyed larger targets with smaller forces than a single damaged Dreadnought. It simply required proper planning and exploitation of the enemy's assumptions. Vrask's target wasn't the Gargant. It was what fueled the Gargant and everything else in the settlement. The Orks needed promethium and ammunition in vast quantities to keep their war machine running. They would have stockpiles, carefully guarded by mech standards, but still vulnerable to someone who knew what to look for. And Vrask's sensors had already identified the likely location. A fortified bunker near the center of the settlement, close to the workshops, but separated by berms and blast walls from other structures. The approach would be difficult. Even with most of their forces deployed elsewhere, the settlement still contained hundreds of Orks, any of whom might spot him and raise the alarm. But Vrask had advantages that the greenskins couldn't match. His sensors let him track Ork movements from beyond visual range. His cognitive processing allowed him to calculate patrol routes and identify gaps in their coverage. And most importantly, the Orks weren't expecting an attack on their settlement. Why would they? Their enemy was out in the Badlands, running and hiding, not preparing to assault their stronghold. Vrask moved with the patience that had been drilled into him during his training with the Alpha Legion. He used every scrap of cover, every shadow, every moment when Ork attention was focused elsewhere. His damaged systems actually helped in some ways, forcing him to move more slowly and deliberately, making him less likely to be spotted by casual observation. He was a wraith haunting the edges of the settlement, present but unseen, deadly but not yet striking. It took him 3 hours to reach the fuel bunker. 3 hours of careful movement, of holding position while Ork patrols passed within meters, of calculating every step to minimize his sensor signature. By the time he reached the bunker's blast walls, his reactor was running dangerously hot from the strain of maintaining stealth systems he hadn't been designed to use. But he was there, positioned for the strike that would either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. The bunker was guarded, naturally. 2 Orks in crude armor stood at the entrance, their weapons ready, but their attention focused more on complaining to each other than on actual security. Vrask studied them through his sensors, analyzing their equipment and behavior, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When it came, when one of the guards turned away to yell something at a passing grot and the other's attention followed, Vrask moved with the speed that only a Dreadnought could achieve in short bursts. He crossed the open ground in 4 massive strides, his power loader arms extending toward the guards before they could react. Both Orks died without raising an alarm, their necks snapped by hydraulic force before they could do more than register surprise. The bunker door was locked, but Vrask's plasma cutter made short work of the mechanism. The superheated beam carved through metal and machinery with the ease of a knife through flesh, creating an opening large enough for his bulk to enter. Inside, his sensors confirmed what he had suspected. Rows of fuel barrels and ammunition crates, stacked floor to ceiling in a space designed to hold vast quantities of war material. It was perfect. More than perfect. This was exactly what he needed. Vrask began placing his mining charges with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying demolitions. The charges were old, their casings corroded, and their control systems questionable, but his analysis suggested they would still function if detonated properly. He positioned them throughout the bunker, using his knowledge of blast patterns and structural engineering to ensure maximum effect. Each charge was set to magnify the next, creating a cascade that would turn the bunker's contents into one massive explosion. The process took 20 minutes, time during which Vrask was acutely aware that discovery was increasingly likely. His sensors tracked Ork movements outside, detected the approach of vehicles, and the casual wandering of greenskins going about their business. Every second increased the probability that someone would notice the guard's absence, would investigate, would raise an alarm before he could complete his preparations. But luck, or perhaps the Emperor's will, held. Vrask finished placing the last charge and began backing toward the entrance, his manipulator arms working carefully to ensure the detonation sequence was properly initialized. The charges would go off in 60 seconds, giving him barely enough time to clear the immediate blast radius. That was when everything went wrong. An Ork mech boy, not Grabbits, but another greenskin engineer, chose that exact moment to approach the bunker. The mech was carrying what appeared to be a jerrycan of promethium, probably intending to refuel some project in his workshop. He rounded the corner and found himself face to face with Vrask's towering form, the Dreadnought illuminated by the light spilling from the breached bunker door. For a heartbeat, Ork and Space Marine simply stared at each other, each processing what they were seeing. Then the mech did what Orks always did when surprised. He started screaming at the top of his lungs while simultaneously reaching for his weapons. Vrask's response was immediate and violent. His power loader arm lashed out, catching the mech in mid-yell and hurling him bodily into a nearby wall with force enough to pulp organs. But the damage was done. The alarm had been raised. Across the settlement, Orks were responding to their comrades' warning, grabbing weapons and turning toward the bunker. 45 seconds until detonation. Vrask ran, not with stealth this time, but with desperate speed, his damaged legs pumping as he pushed his reactor past every safety limit. Behind him, Orks were emerging from structures, weapons tracking his fleeing form, voices raised in that distinctive battle cry that was equal parts rage and enthusiasm. Ahead, the settlement's perimeter fence loomed, crude but substantial, an obstacle that would require valuable seconds to overcome. 30 seconds. He could hear vehicles starting up, the roar of Ork engines firing in response to the alarm. Heavier weapons were being brought to bear, the distinctive sound of big shooters and rockets being armed. If they caught him in the open, if they pinned him down before the charges detonated, this would all be for nothing. 20 seconds. Vrask reached the perimeter fence and simply crashed through it, his mass and momentum overcoming the crude construction. The impact damaged his already compromised armor further, but he was through, clear of the settlement's immediate interior, putting distance between himself and the bunker. 10 seconds. He threw himself into the nearest depression in the terrain, a crater that might have been natural or might have been the result of some previous Ork accident. His systems registered impacts on his armor as Ork weapons fire found him, shells and bullets pinging off adamantium, but he was down, protected by the crater's rim from the worst of the barrage. 5 seconds. The world exploded. The mining charges detonated in sequence, their blast waves overlapping and reinforcing each other exactly as Vrask had calculated. The fuel barrels ignited, their contents adding thermal energy to the mechanical force of the explosives. The ammunition began cooking off, bullets and rockets adding to the chaos. And the bunker itself, weakened by the initial blasts, came apart in a fireball that consumed everything within 100 meters. The shockwave hit Vrask like a physical blow, slamming into his position with force enough to make even his massive form slide backward. Heat washed over him, so intense that his external sensors temporarily overloaded, showing nothing but white noise and error messages. The sound was beyond description, beyond measurement, a roar that seemed to come from the planet itself. When Vrask's sensors recovered enough to process input again, he witnessed something that would have been beautiful if it weren't born of such violence. The Ork settlement was burning, not just the bunker, but everything around it. The blast had thrown burning debris across the entire central area, setting fire to workshops and vehicle parks and living quarters. Ammunition was detonating in a cascading chain reaction, secondary explosions creating new fires that spread to consume more structures. Orks were running in every direction, some trying to fight the fires, others simply fleeing the chaos, many burning alive as they struggled to escape the inferno. And the Gargant was moving, its massive form lurching into motion as its crew attempted to bring its weapons to bear. But even that titan of Ork engineering was not immune to the devastation. Burning debris had struck its hull, fires were spreading across its lower sections, and several of its weapon systems appeared to be damaged or destroyed. It was still functional, still a threat beyond anything Vrask could handle, but it was wounded in ways that would take the Orks days or weeks to repair. Vrask didn't wait to see what would happen next. He pulled himself from the crater and began moving away from the settlement, using the smoke and chaos to mask his retreat. Orks were shouting and firing weapons in all directions, their normal aggressive tendencies amplified by the confusion. Some were even fighting each other, too overwhelmed by the situation to properly identify targets. He had done it, had struck at the heart of the Orc settlement and survived, had proven that even a damaged, improvised, jury-rigged dreadnought could hurt an enemy if the warrior inside was clever enough and determined enough. The Alpha Legion would have approved, he thought, assuming any of them still lived to approve of anything. But he couldn't celebrate, couldn't pause to appreciate what he had accomplished, because his senses were telling him something that turned his victory Pyrrhic. His reactor, pushed far beyond its design specifications for far too long, was finally beginning to fail, not catastrophically, not the explosive meltdown he had risked earlier, but a slower, more insidious failure. His power output was dropping, systems were shutting down one by one, and his fuel reserves were so depleted that even emergency reserves were reading nearly empty. Vrask had won the battle, but lost the war. He had hurt the Orks, had destroyed a significant portion of their supplies and infrastructure, had proven himself worthy of his legion's legacy. But in doing so, he had burned through the last of his operational capacity. His dreadnought chassis, already damaged beyond proper function, was now dying around him, and there was no one coming to save him, no rescue that would arrive in the nick of time. He was going to die out here, alone on an alien world, 5,000 years displaced from his own time. His brothers would never know what had happened to him. The Imperium would never learn of his final stand. He would simply cease to exist, another casualty of the eternal war, forgotten before he was even properly mourned. But he would die as he had lived, as a warrior of the Alpha Legion. In the shadows, striking from unexpected angles, making the enemy pay the highest possible price for their victory. That would have to be enough. Vrask found a narrow canyon, barely wide enough for his bulk, and positioned himself facing back toward the burning settlement. His power loader arms locked into combat position, ready to sell his last moments as dearly as possible. His plasma cutter still held partial charge, enough for perhaps 2 or 3 more shots. His reactor stabilized at the minimal level necessary to keep his biological components alive and his most basic systems functional. And he waited. Waited for the Orks to organize themselves, to track him to this final position, to come for their revenge. Waited for the end that he had earned through 5,000 years of service and a final week of defiance. The smoke from the burning settlement rose into the alien sky, a pillar of darkness visible for kilometers. And in a canyon beneath that smoke, an Alpha Legion dreadnought prepared to face his final battle. Aftermath and echoes. Kalen Vrask did not die that day. Not through any miracle, not through last-minute rescue, but through simple mathematics. The Orks, their settlement burning and their supplies destroyed, made a calculation that warriors of any species would recognize. The cost of pursuing one damaged enemy, even one who had hurt them badly, exceeded the benefit of revenge. They had more pressing concerns, fighting the fires, recovering what supplies they could salvage, rebuilding their infrastructure. The hunt for the escaped dreadnought became a lower priority. Some Orks objected, of course. Warboss Gork Smasher Ironjaw bellowed for vengeance, demanded that the sneaky git be found and brought before him for proper crumping. But even he had to acknowledge that his warband's operational capacity had been severely compromised. They couldn't afford to waste resources on what amounted to a personal grudge, not when there were practical needs to address. The compromise, reached through the kind of brutal Orc democracy where the loudest voice generally prevailed, was simple. They would fortify their settlement, repair their gargant, and resume their original war plans. The escaped dreadnought could stay out in the Badlands if it wanted. If it made the mistake of showing itself again, they would deal with it then. But they wouldn't waste time and fuel searching for something that might have already died from its injuries. In his canyon, Vrask monitored these developments through his sensors, listening to Orc communications and tracking their vehicle movements. He understood what was happening, recognized the reprieve for what it was. The Orcs had written him off, dismissed him as no longer worth the effort. It was insulting, perhaps, but it was also survival. Days passed, then weeks. Vrask remained in his canyon, allowing his systems to run in the lowest power state possible to conserve his failing reactor. He couldn't move far, couldn't engage in combat, could barely maintain consciousness for more than a few hours at a time. But he was alive, in whatever limited sense a consciousness trapped in a dying machine could claim to be alive. The canyon became his world. He studied every rock, every shadow, every variation in the wind patterns. His sensors mapped it in exhaustive detail, creating three-dimensional models that his mind turned over and examined from every angle during the long hours when there was nothing else to do. It was meditation of a sort, the kind of focused awareness that Space Marines used to maintain mental discipline during extended operations. And during those meditations, during those endless hours of enforced stillness, Vrask thought about his situation with a clarity that the chaos of recent events had not allowed. He thought about the 5,000 years he had lost, about the brothers who had placed him in stasis and never returned. He thought about the Alpha Legion's scattered remnants, pursuing goals across the galaxy that he would never understand. He thought about duty and service, and the price that warriors paid for immortality in metal tombs. He wondered if he should have stayed asleep, if it would have been kinder to simply remain in stasis, to never wake to this nightmare of displacement and loss. But that thought brought others. Would the Orks have eventually found a way to wake him anyway? Would he have preferred to wake in their workshop, helpless and unaware, rather than having the chance to fight back? No. Whatever else could be said about his situation, at least he had fought. Had proven that even after 5,000 years, even looted and modified and broken, an Alpha Legion warrior could still hurt the enemies of mankind. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. The weeks turned into months. The Orc settlement rebuilt itself, the greenskins proving remarkably resilient in the face of catastrophe. Their gargant was repaired, their vehicle parks restocked, their fuel reserves replenished through whatever means Orcs used to acquire such things. Eventually, the warband departed, lifting off in their crude spacecraft to pursue whatever war they had originally been engaged in. The settlement was abandoned, left behind as the Orcs moved on to more interesting fights. Vrask remained. Where else would he go? He had no ship, no way to leave the planet. His Dreadnought was dying around him, systems failing one by one despite his best efforts at maintenance. He was stranded on a world that Imperial records no longer accurately mapped, in a sector that had probably been reclassified a dozen times since his internment. No one was coming for him. No one even knew he existed. But he was not entirely alone. His sensors detected life in the Badlands, creatures that had adapted to the harsh environment. Small reptilian things that hunted in packs, larger predators that prowled the canyons at night, even some kind of plant life, hardy vegetation that managed to extract nutrients from the barren soil. The planet was not dead, merely sleeping, much as Vrask himself had slept for so long. And then, on what his internal chronometer calculated as the 307th day since his awakening, his sensors detected something that made his dying systems surge with desperate hope. A ship in orbit. Not an Orc vessel, but something else. Something that read as possibly Imperial in origin. It was conducting what appeared to be a survey scan, mapping the planet's surface with active sensor sweeps. Vrask tried to hail them, using every communication protocol he could remember from his time in service. But his transmitters were damaged, his power output insufficient to punch through the planet's atmosphere with any signal strong enough to be detected. He watched helplessly as the ship completed its survey and began moving away, its engines building toward the kind of energy signature that preceded a warp jump. In desperation, in the wild hope that somehow he might be heard, Vrask burned the last of his power reserves in one massive transmission burst. Every protocol he knew, every frequency he could access, every possible combination of codes and ciphers that might identify him as Imperial rather than Xenos. He broadcast continuously for 30 seconds, pouring energy into his transmitters that his dying reactor could not sustain, gambling everything on the chance that someone was listening. And then his power failed, not gradually, not with warnings and time to prepare, but suddenly and completely. 1. And then his power failed, not gradually, not with warnings and time to prepare, but suddenly and completely. One moment Vrask was broadcasting with everything he had. The next he was plunging into darkness as his reactor finally gave up its 5,000-year struggle to keep functioning. His optical sensors went dark. His auditory processors fell silent. His connection to his mechanical body severed as the neural interfaces lost power. For the second time in his impossibly long existence, Kalen Vrask experienced the sensation of death. Not the peaceful drift into stasis sleep, but the violent cessation of all function, the terrifying awareness of systems shutting down while his consciousness remained trapped within them. He was aware, still thinking, still experiencing, but cut off from any ability to perceive or interact with the world around him. His organic brain, the small cluster of grey matter that was all that remained of his human body, continued functioning on its own biological reserves. Without the life support systems that had sustained him for so long, he had perhaps minutes before oxygen deprivation began killing neurons. Perhaps an hour before brain death became irreversible. It was a countdown he could feel in the growing fog that clouded his thoughts, in the way his consciousness began fragmenting into disconnected observations and memories. He thought of Terra, the planet he had never actually seen, having been recruited from a colony world whose name he could no longer remember. He thought of his first battle as a scout marine, the terror and exhilaration of combat against enemies who had seemed so overwhelming at the time. He thought of his promotion to full battle brother status, the pride of being judged worthy to wear the full power armor of the Legiones Astartes. He thought of the day he had been selected for the Alpha Legion's operations, pulled from the standard ranks to serve in the shadows, the extensive retraining, the psychological conditioning, the lessons in deception and misdirection that had transformed him from a straightforward warrior into something more subtle and dangerous. He had been good at it, had taken to the Legion's methods with an aptitude that his instructors praised. He thought of his squad, the brothers he had served with for decades. Their names came to him through the fog. Talos, who had specialized in infiltration. Mordian, the squad's heavy weapons expert. Jerick, whose talent for languages and mimicry had made him invaluable for undercover work. All of them probably dead for 5,000 years, their bones long since turned to dust, or their gene seed harvested for future generations. He thought of the moment his spine had broken, that terrible sensation of his body simply ceasing to respond to his commands. The chaos of the retreat, his brothers carrying him from the battlefield while Imperial fists pursued them with righteous fury. The apothecaries telling him there was nothing they could do, that his injuries were beyond their ability to repair. The cold calculation in their voices as they offered him the choice, death with honor, or internment in a Dreadnought chassis to continue serving. He had chosen service, had chosen to continue the fight even in a form that was more machine than man, had believed that his duty to the Emperor, or to whatever the Alpha Legion truly served, required that sacrifice. Had he been right? Had his service meant anything? Had those 2 decades of fighting in a Dreadnought chassis, those few ambushes against Ork searchers, that single act of sabotage against their settlement, had any of it made a difference in the vast sweep of galactic history? He would never know, would die here without answers, without understanding, without ever learning what had become of the Legion he had served or the Imperium he had sworn to protect. His death would be unmarked, unrecorded, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Just another casualty in a war that had no end. The darkness was complete now. His thoughts were fragmenting, coherence becoming harder to maintain. He felt his sense of self beginning to dissolve, the boundaries between memory and imagination blurring. Soon there would be nothing, just the final silence that awaited all warriors who fought for too long. And then, impossibly, there was light. Not the light of his optical senses, which remained dark. Not any light he could see in a conventional sense, but awareness of something changing in his immediate environment, a presence that his dying brain struggled to identify. Vibrations conducted through the stone of the canyon floor, the sensation of something large moving nearby, the distant sound of engines, mechanical noise that penetrated even his damaged auditory systems through simple physical resonance. Someone was here. Something had come to the canyon where he lay dying. Vrask tried to move, tried to activate any system that might respond, but there was nothing. He was paralyzed, helpless, unable even to identify what was happening around him. All he could do was wait, consciousness fading with each passing second, and hope that whatever had arrived was not another orc scavenging party come to finish what they had started. He felt contact, hands on his armor, multiple sets of them, working at access panels and external connections with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of expertise. Tech priests, perhaps. That would make sense if the ship in orbit had been Imperial. But would they recognize what he was? Would they understand that beneath the orc modifications and improvised repairs, there was a space marine dreadnought containing a warrior who still lived? Power began flowing into his systems. Not his reactor, which was dead beyond any field revival, but external power sources being connected to his emergency intake ports. It was crude, far less than his systems normally required, but it was enough to start bringing basic functions online. His life support reactivated first, blessed oxygen flooding back into his sarcophagus, allowing his organic body to begin recovering from the oxygen deprivation that had nearly killed him. His acoustic sensors came next, feeding him fragmentary audio as they struggled to function on minimal power. Voices, speaking Gothic, the official language of the Imperium. Not the crude pidgin that many Imperial citizens spoke, but proper High Gothic with precise diction. Tech priests, almost certainly, discussing his condition in terms that mixed religious invocations with technical analysis. Pattern suggests Contemptor class, though extensively modified. Biosigns present but weak. Recommend immediate medical intervention. Markings consistent with pre-heresy manufacture. Possibility of STC template verification. Machine spirit is agitated, possibly corrupted by Xenos contact. Vrask wanted to laugh at that last comment, wanted to tell them that his machine spirit wasn't corrupted, merely furious at being looted and abandoned and left to die. But his communication systems were still offline, his connection to his Vox speakers too weak to generate the power needed for speech. He felt himself being moved, lifted by machinery far more sophisticated than the crude orc cranes that had extracted him from his stasis vault. The sensation was almost gentle, a stark contrast to the rough handling he had experienced from the greenskins. His chassis was being treated with the reverence that tech priests reserve for sacred relics, each movement carefully controlled to minimize stress on his damaged structure. Transport followed, though Vrask could only perceive it as motion and vibration. He was being carried somewhere, loaded onto some kind of vehicle or cargo hauler. The journey seemed to take hours, though his temporal perception was unreliable, without full access to his chronometer systems. Eventually, the motion stopped, and he felt a different kind of movement. The distinctive sensation of being lifted into orbit, the transition from planetary gravity to the artificial G-forces of spacecraft propulsion. He was leaving HD 778 Secundus. After 9 months trapped on that desolate world, fighting for survival against impossible odds, he was finally escaping. But escape to what? Where was he being taken? And most importantly, would they understand what he was? Or would they simply see him as salvage to be studied and dissected? The hours blurred together. More work on his systems, tech priests muttering prayers as they tried to assess the full extent of his damage. He caught fragments of their conversations, enough to understand that they were both fascinated and confused by what they had found. A dreadnought of ancient pattern, heavily modified by Xenos hands, containing a space marine whose gene seed markers they couldn't immediately identify. That last point concerned Vrask greatly. The Alpha Legion's gene seed had always been different, modified in ways that set them apart from other legions. If these tech priests couldn't identify his legion affiliation, what would they conclude? Would they assume he was corrupted? Would they treat him as a potential heretic until proven otherwise? Gradually, as more power was fed into his systems and his life support stabilized, Vrask's consciousness became clearer. He was still paralyzed, still unable to communicate effectively, but his cognitive functions were recovering. He could think more clearly, could process the sensory input he was receiving, could begin planning for what would come next. The key question was simple. What would he tell them when his communication systems were finally restored? The truth was complicated, perhaps too complicated. He was an Alpha Legion space marine who had been in stasis for 5,000 years, awakened by Orks, and had spent months fighting a guerrilla campaign before being rescued by what appeared to be an Imperial ship. That narrative invited questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The Alpha Legion had always excelled at creating cover stories, at crafting identities that served their purposes while concealing their true nature. Vrask began constructing such a story now, building it carefully in his mind as his systems continued their slow recovery. He would need to be careful, would need to balance truth with necessary deception, would need to provide enough information to satisfy their curiosity without revealing things that could compromise Legion operations that might still be ongoing. Assuming, of course, that there were any Legion operations still ongoing. Assuming that after 5,000 years, the Alpha Legion still existed in any meaningful form. Assuming that any of his brothers would even recognize him or acknowledge his service if he somehow managed to contact them. The future was uncertain, but then it had always been uncertain. That was the nature of serving in the 8th Legion, of fighting wars that no one else knew were being waged, of pursuing objectives that might take centuries to achieve. Uncertainty was the water he swam in, the air he breathed. He could handle uncertainty. What he couldn't handle was the alternative: permanent death, final silence, the absolute cessation of service. As long as he still functioned, still thought, still existed in some form, he could continue to serve, could continue to fight, could continue to be what he had always been, a warrior in the shadows, striking from unexpected angles, pursuing goals that others might not understand. The Alpha Legion had taught him well, and, whatever came next, whatever future awaited him aboard this Imperial ship, he would face it as he had faced everything since his awakening, with cunning, with determination, and with the absolute refusal to accept defeat. His optical sensors flickered, power finally reaching the systems that would allow him to see again. The world resolved slowly, details emerging from darkness as his visual processors calibrated and adjusted. He was in a hold of some kind, secured to maintenance cradles, surrounded by tech priests in their distinctive red robes. Servitors moved in the background, their mechanical augmentations allowing them to handle heavy equipment with inhuman efficiency. And standing before his sarcophagus, studying him with an intensity that Vrask could feel even through his armored shell, was a figure in power armor. Not the red of the Mechanicus, but the blue of an Adeptus Astartes chapter, whose heraldry Vrask did not immediately recognize. The Space Marine's helmet was maglocked to his belt, revealing a weathered face marked with the scars of decades of combat. The Marine spoke, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the weight of suspicion. "Ancient One, if you can hear me, know that you are aboard the strike cruiser, Righteous Vengeance. We found you on HD 778 Secundus during a routine survey mission. Your identification marks are unclear. Your gene seed registers as Space Marine, but the specific chapter cannot be determined from available data. Before we proceed with full restoration of your systems, I must ask, who are you and what chapter do you serve?" It was the question Vrask had been expecting, the challenge he would need to navigate carefully. His vocal systems were still weak, his vox speakers barely functional, but he had enough power to respond. He chose his words carefully, building his cover story from components of truth, mixed with necessary omission. When he spoke, his voice was a mechanical rasp, distorted by damaged audio processors and weakened power systems. But it was audible, and more importantly, it was believable. I am Brother Kalen, of the 13th Legion, interred during the heresy. My facility was lost. I have slept for I do not know how long. It was technically true. The Alpha Legion had been the 20th Legion, but claiming allegiance to the 13th, the Ultramarines, was a safe deception. They were numerous, widespread, and had countless successor chapters. A Dreadnought from their ranks, lost during the heresy and only recently rediscovered, would be unusual, but not impossible. And it would explain any irregularities in his gene seed markers, any differences in his training or behavior. The heresy had been a time of chaos, when records were lost and warriors were scattered across the galaxy. The Space Marine before him studied Vrask's sarcophagus with increased intensity, clearly evaluating this claim. The Ultramarines. Your armor bears no chapter markings, no honors.
That would confirm this claim. And the modifications. These are clearly Xeno's work. How did you come to be in such condition? Another question, another opportunity to build the narrative. Vrask forced his damaged systems to respond, to provide answers that would satisfy without revealing. Orks found my facility, looted me. I awakened during their examination, fought free, survived months in the Badlands. When you arrived, my reactor was failing. You saved me from final death. It was a story that fit the evidence they had observed. A Dreadnought found alone on a dead world, heavily modified by Orks, barely functional. It explained his condition without raising too many questions about his origins or his activities during the 5,000 years he couldn't account for. The Space Marine turned to confer with one of the tech priests, their conversation conducted in low tones that Vrask's damaged acoustic sensors couldn't fully capture. He caught fragments. Gene seed analysis required, and verification through records, and treat with appropriate honor. Finally, the Space Marine turned back to face Vrask's position. Very well, Ancient. Your story will be verified, of course, but for now, you are under the protection of the Crimson Hawks chapter. Our tech marines will work to restore your systems and repair the damage you have sustained. You have fought well to survive this long. Rest now and know that you are among brothers again. Brothers. The word echoed through Vrask's consciousness with complex resonance. These were not his brothers, not truly. They were sons of Guilliman, inheritors of a tradition that the Alpha Legion had always viewed with a mixture of respect and contempt. But they were Space Marines, servants of the Imperium, warriors who shared at least some of the values and purposes that had driven Vrask throughout his long service. It would have to be enough. He had no other options, no other path forward. He would accept their help, would allow them to repair his Dreadnought chassis, would become part of whatever chapter or fleet or operation they served. And perhaps in time, he would find a way to contact whatever remained of the Alpha Legion, to let them know that one of their ancient warriors still lived, still served, still carried on the traditions of the Sixth. But that was for the future. For now, he allowed his systems to relax, to accept the care being offered, to drift into a state that wasn't quite sleep, but was close enough. He had survived. Against all odds, against every tactical calculation that said he should have died in that Ork workshop or on that desolate world, he had survived. Kalen Vrask, Alpha Legion Space Marine, 5,000 years displaced from his own time, looted and modified and broken but never defeated, had found a new chapter in his impossibly long existence. Where it would lead, what it would mean, remained to be seen. But he was still fighting. And as long as he could fight, as long as he could serve, that was all that truly mattered. Reflections on duty and time. The restoration took months. The Crimson Hawks tech marines were thorough,
treating Vrask's Dreadnought chassis with the reverence reserved for ancient relics, while simultaneously working to understand and repair the extensive damage he had sustained. They removed the Ork modifications with something approaching horror, their reactions to the crude Xenos work ranging from disgust to professional fascination. The mechboy alterations had been extensive. Grabbits and his fellow Orks had disconnected safety systems, rerouted power conduits in ways that violated every principle of proper engineering, and attached components that had no business being integrated with Space Marine technology. The Tech Marines catalogued each modification meticulously, documenting the Xenos' approach to machinery with the kind of detailed attention that scholars gave to dangerous heresies. But beneath the Ork work, they found something that commanded even greater respect: a Contemptor-pattern Dreadnought in remarkably good condition considering its age. The chassis dated to the Great Crusade, manufactured during an era when the Imperium's technological capabilities exceeded what current generations could achieve. The reactor, though dead, showed signs of sophisticated design that modern tech priests struggled to fully comprehend. The neural interface systems were so advanced that the Tech Marines admitted they didn't entirely understand how they functioned. Through it all, Vrask remained largely silent. He answered questions when asked, provided technical information about his systems when requested, but offered little about himself beyond what his initial cover story required. The Crimson Hawks accepted this with the understanding that ancient warriors often became taciturn, their personalities eroded by centuries of service in mechanical shells. They didn't push for details about battles he couldn't discuss, didn't demand explanations for gaps in his narrative. Gene seed analysis had been inconclusive, as Vrask had expected. His biology showed markers consistent with Space Marine enhancement, but the specific chapter origin remained ambiguous. The Tech Marines attributed this to age and the degradation that 5,000 years could inflict on organic tissue, even when preserved in stasis. They logged him as 13th Legion, designation uncertain, subject to further review, and moved on to more pressing concerns. During those months of repair, as new components were fabricated and installed, as systems were recalibrated and tested, Vrask had time to think about his situation with a clarity that the chaos of recent events had not permitted. He was, in many ways, a ghost, haunting the present from the past. Everything he had known was gone. The Imperium had changed. The Space Marines had been reorganized. Technology had declined. The galaxy itself had evolved in ways he could barely comprehend. The Crimson Hawks shared information freely, assuming that a warrior who had been in stasis for 5 millennia would need to be briefed on current events. Vrask learned about the Horus heresy from the perspective of loyalist historians, a sanitized version that portrayed clear heroes and villains in a conflict he remembered as far more ambiguous. He learned about the Second Founding and the breaking of the legions into chapters, a reorganization that would have been unthinkable in his era. He learned about the Codex Astartes and the reverence with which it was treated, this guide to warfare written by a Primarch who had still been alive when Vrask entered stasis. He learned about the current state of the Imperium, the endless wars against Chaos, Xenos, and heretics, the religious worship of the Emperor as a god rather than simply as humanity's greatest leader, the technological stagnation that had reduced humanity to barely understanding the machines it depended upon, the sheer scale of bureaucratic calcification that had transformed the Imperium into something that would have horrified its founders. And he learned about the Alpha Legion, or at least what the Imperium believed about them. In official histories, the 10th Legion were traitors who had sided with Horus and fought against the Imperium throughout the heresy. They were listed alongside the other traitor legions, their names spoken with the same hatred reserved for the most corrupt servants of chaos. No mention was made of their true purposes, their actual objectives, the possibility that their betrayal might have been something more complex than simple treachery. Vrask listened to these accounts and said nothing. What could he say? That the truth was more complicated, that the Alpha Legion's actions during the heresy might have served purposes that transcended simple loyalty or betrayal, that some of them, at least, had believed they were serving the Emperor's ultimate interests, even as they fought against his forces. Such arguments would only raise suspicions, would only call into question the story he had told about being an ultramarine. Better to remain silent, to let the Crimson Hawks believe what they wanted to believe about the heresy and its participants. Better to focus on the present, rather than trying to explain a past that no one truly understood. The repairs were finally completed after 4 months of constant work. Vrask's Dreadnought had been essentially rebuilt, his chassis restored to something approaching its original configuration. A new reactor had been installed, manufactured using techniques that the tech marines admitted were only approximations of the original design. New weapons had been mounted, an assault cannon on his right arm and a power fist on his left, standard armament for dreadnoughts of the current era. His armor had been repainted in colors that he had not worn for 5,000 years, the blue of the Ultramarines, though in a shade that acknowledged his uncertain chapter affiliation. He tested his new systems methodically, running through combat drills under the supervision of the Crimson Hawks training cadre. The movements felt wrong at first, different from what his neural pathways remembered. But slowly, over days of practice, he adjusted to the new configuration. He learned to compensate for the different weapon balance, for the slight variations in servo response, for all the small ways in which this restored body differed from the one he had known. And through it all, he maintained his cover. He was Brother Kalen, ancient warrior of uncertain provenance, rescued from Xenos captivity and restored to service. He asked appropriate questions about current tactics and doctrine. He listened respectfully when the Crimson Hawks explained how warfare had evolved since his time. He gave the appearance of an ancient warrior adapting to the present, all while carefully concealing the full depth of his knowledge and capabilities. The Crimson Hawks chapter master, a warrior named Secundus Aaron, eventually summoned Vrask to his quarters. The meeting was formal but respectful, 2 Space Marines acknowledging each other's status, even as they navigated the complexities of their situation. "Brother Kalen," Aaron began, his tone carrying the weight of command tempered with genuine respect. "Your restoration is complete. You are operational again, ready to return to the Emperor's service. The question now is, what do you want that service to look like?" It was a fair question, one that Vrask had been anticipating. "I wish to fight," he said simply. "I have been dormant too long. The galaxy still needs warriors, and I can still serve." Aaron nodded slowly. "We would be honored to have you join our chapter if you wish. An ancient warrior of your experience would be a valuable addition to our ranks. We could offer you a place among our Dreadnought brothers, opportunities to share your knowledge with our younger warriors." It was a generous offer, more generous than Vrask had any right to expect, but accepting it would mean becoming permanently attached to the Crimson Hawks, submitting to their command structure, integrating himself into their traditions and operations. It would mean giving up any hope of contacting the Alpha Legion or pursuing objectives that diverged from the chapter's goals. "I am honored," Vrask said carefully, "but I wonder if there might be another path. I have been asleep for 5,000 years. Perhaps it would serve me better to spend time moving between different chapters, learning how warfare has evolved, gathering knowledge of the current galaxy before committing to a single command." Aaron considered this, his expression thoughtful. "You wish to serve as an itinerant, a warrior who offers his services where they are needed rather than binding himself to a single chapter?" "Something like that," Vrask confirmed. "I have much to relearn about this age. Moving between different forces would help me understand the breadth of the Imperium's current challenges." It was a reasonable request, and one that had precedent in Space Marine culture. Some ancient warriors did move between chapters, their expertise valued enough that individual commands were willing to share them. It would give Vrask freedom of movement, opportunities to search for any remnants of the Alpha Legion, while ostensibly serving the broader Imperium. Aaron was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. You may serve as you suggest, at least for a time. We will provide you with documentation and recommendations that will help you gain acceptance in other chapters. But know that the Crimson Hawks will always welcome you should you choose to make us your permanent home. And so, it was arranged. Vrask would leave the Crimson Hawks, would begin moving through the Imperium as an ancient warrior, offering his services wherever they were needed. He would fight in battles across dozens of worlds, would serve alongside chapters whose names he had never heard, would immerse himself in the current age until he understood it as well as he had understood his own era. But always, beneath the surface, he would be searching for signs of the Alpha Legion, searching for evidence that his brothers still operated in the shadows, searching for a way to reconnect with the tradition he had never truly abandoned, even when forced to hide it behind layers of deception. Years passed. Decades. Vrask fought in wars that ranged from minor skirmishes to sector-wide campaigns. He served alongside Ultramarines and their successors, learning their methods and absorbing their culture. He fought with Space Wolves and witnessed their savage glory. He joined Blood Angels in their struggle against the Black Rage, understanding their pain in ways that few outsiders could. And through it all, he learned. He learned how the Imperium had evolved, how the Space Marines had adapted to changing circumstances, how the endless war against Chaos and Xenos continued in forms both familiar and strange. He learned about new threats that had emerged since his time. The Tyranids, with their all-consuming hunger, the awakening Necrons with their ancient technology, the expanding reach of Chaos cults throughout Imperial space. He also learned about the Alpha Legion's current reputation. They were feared and hated, considered among the most dangerous of the traitor legions precisely because their methods were so difficult to counter. There were reports of Alpha Legion activity in dozens of sectors, operations that suggested the X-6th still operated according to principles that Vrask recognized from his own training. But these reports were fragmentary, contradictory, impossible to verify with certainty. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, when his Dreadnought stood in some chapter's armory awaiting the next deployment, Vrask wondered if he would ever find them, if he would ever make contact with whatever the Alpha Legion had become, or if he was truly the last, a ghost from an age that was gone forever, carrying traditions and knowledge that no one else remembered or understood. But these were passing thoughts, brief moments of uncertainty in a life defined by purpose and service. He was still fighting, still serving, still pursuing the mission that the Alpha Legion had given him 5,000 years ago, even if the specific objectives had been lost to time. That had to be enough. That was all he had. The galaxy turned. Wars were fought and concluded. Heroes rose and fell. The Imperium endured, as it always had, sustained by the sacrifice of billions and the faith of trillions. And through it all, a single Dreadnought moved between battlefields, an ancient warrior whose true nature remained hidden behind layers of deception and cover stories. Kalen Vrask of the Alpha Legion had survived his awakening in Ork hands, had survived 5,000 years of displacement, had survived the loss of everything he had known, and he would continue to survive, continue to fight, continue to serve, for as long as his mechanical body and his organic mind held together. Because that was what Space Marines did, what the Alpha Legion had always done. They endured, they adapted, they fought on, no matter the odds, no matter the cost, no matter how long the war lasted. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that was the closest thing to victory that anyone could hope to achieve. The nature of immortality. 50 years after his recovery by the Crimson Hawks, Vrask found himself contemplating the true meaning of the life he had been given. He was stationed temporarily with the Raptors chapter, a successor of the Raven Guard known for their pragmatic approach to warfare. They had welcomed him with the respect due to an ancient warrior, had given him quarters in their fortress monastery on the world of Jovan Tertius, and had included him in their operations against an Ork war
that threatened the sector. It was after one such operation, a successful ambush that had destroyed 3 Ork vehicles and scattered a greenskin mob, that Vrask finally allowed himself to acknowledge something he had been avoiding for decades. He was immortal, or as close to immortal as anything biological could be. Barring catastrophic damage or complete system failure, he could theoretically continue existing indefinitely, sustained by the Dreadnought's life support and the care of whatever tech priests maintained his systems. The thought brought no comfort. Immortality sounded glorious in theory. Eternal service to the Emperor, unlimited time to perfect one's craft as a warrior, the opportunity to witness ages of history firsthand. But the reality was far grimmer. Immortality meant watching everyone you knew die. It meant experiencing centuries or millennia of disconnection from the current age, becoming increasingly out of touch with the living universe around you. It meant the slow erosion of your humanity, the gradual transformation from person to artifact. Vrask had already experienced this to a degree. The 5,000 years of stasis had robbed him of everyone he had known during his original life. The brothers he had served with, the officers he had reported to, even the primarchs who had led the legions, all were dust, or worse. When he had awakened, he had been alone in a way that transcended simple isolation. He had been disconnected from the entire continuity of his existence. But at least stasis had been merciful in one way. It had been instantaneous from his perspective. He had gone to sleep in one age and awakened in another without experiencing the passage of time between. Now, as an active Dreadnought serving in the current Imperium, he was experiencing time normally, which meant he was watching the gradual accumulation of loss that true immortality entailed. The Crimson Hawks. Chapter Master, who had authorized his departure, was dead, killed in a void battle 3 years after Vrask had left. The tech marines who had rebuilt his chassis were all gone now, casualties of the endless war, or simply aged into retirement and death. Even some of the younger marines he had met during his recovery were no longer alive, their brief flames extinguished in humanity's eternal struggle for survival. And this was only 50 years. What would it be like after 500? After 5,000? How many generations of warriors would pass through his awareness, each one believing themselves unique, each one following the same patterns their predecessors had followed? How many times would he watch friends and allies die, knowing that he would continue while they did not? The Dreadnoughts of the Raptors gave him some insight into this. They were ancient warriors, some of them veterans of hundreds of years of service, and they bore their immortality with varying degrees of grace. Some had embraced it, becoming living embodiments of their chapter's history and traditions, sources of wisdom and tactical expertise. Others had retreated into themselves, their personalities fragmenting under the weight of time and loss, speaking rarely and only when absolutely necessary. Brother Ancient Corvin, the eldest of the Raptors' dreadnoughts, had been interred for 300 years. He still retained his faculties, could still joke and tell stories and engage meaningfully with his brothers. But there was something in his voice, a quality that Vrask recognized from his own internal state, a kind of fundamental sadness, a grief for all that had been lost. "You're thinking about time," Corvin said one day, his dreadnought positioned beside Vrask's in the chapter's armory. They were alone, the tech marines having completed their maintenance cycles and departed, leaving the 2 ancient warriors in the dim red light of standby mode. "Is it that obvious?" Vrask asked, curious how the other dreadnought had identified his thoughts. "I've been where you are," Corvin replied. "The first century after internment is the hardest. You're still recent enough to remember what it felt like to be flesh, to move without servo assistance, to feel sensation that doesn't come filtered through mechanical sensors. And you're beginning to realize that everyone you knew before your internment is gone or will be gone soon. It's a kind of grief that never fully resolves." Vrask considered this. "How do you handle it? How do you keep going when everything keeps changing around you?" "You find new purposes," Corvin said. "New connections, even if you know they'll be temporary. You focus on the mission, on the immediate objectives, rather than dwelling on the larger sweep of time. And you accept that this is the price of continued service. The Emperor gave us the tools to fight beyond our natural spans, but that gift comes with costs that no one fully explains when you first accept internment. It was wisdom born of centuries, and Vrask absorbed it gratefully. But he also recognized something that Corvin couldn't say, because he didn't know Vrask's true history. The Alpha Legion had trained him for exactly this kind of existence. Long-term operations, maintaining cover identities for years or decades, the patience required for strategies that spanned generations. In some ways, his current life as an itinerant Dreadnought was just an extreme version of the covert operations he had conducted before his internment. "Do you ever regret it?" Vrask asked. "Accepting internment instead of death?" Corvin was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Usually in the moments right after waking from stasis sleep, when the disorientation is worst, and I can't immediately remember where I am or why I'm here. But then the mission briefing comes, and I remember that I'm still needed, that there's still work to do, that my service still matters, and that's enough to push aside the regrets." They stood in companionable silence after that, two ancient warriors contemplating the strange existence they shared. Eventually, Tech Marines returned to begin preparing them for the next operation, and the moment of philosophical reflection passed. But Vrask carried the conversation with him, turned it over in his mind during the hours of waiting that constituted so much of a Dreadnought's existence. He thought about purpose and meaning, about why he continued to fight, about what the Alpha Legion's teachings meant in an age where the Legion itself might no longer exist in any coherent form. He thought about the nature of service, about duty that extended beyond normal human comprehension, about the price that was paid for immortality in steel shells. And he thought about the Orks who had looted him from his tomb, about Grabbits and his workshop, about the modifications they had made with such crude enthusiasm. In a strange way, those greenskins had saved him. Not intentionally, not through any noble purpose, but simply by being what they were. Scavengers who couldn't resist examining anything interesting they found. If the Orks hadn't discovered his facility, hadn't extracted him from stasis, hadn't accidentally triggered his revival protocols, he would still be sleeping in that vault on HD 778 Secundus. Asleep, but not dreaming. Existing, but not living. Preserved perfectly, but utterly disconnected from the universe around him. Would that have been better? Would it have been kinder to let him sleep forever, to never wake him to this strange future where everything he had known was gone? Vrask considered the question with the thoroughness that Alpha Legion training demanded, examining it from every angle, testing different answers against his experience and values, and he concluded, finally, that waking had been better. That this strange half-life as an ancient warrior moving between chapters was preferable to the absolute non-existence of eternal stasis. Because even if the galaxy had changed, even if the Imperium was different, even if the Alpha Legion itself was gone or transformed beyond recognition, there were still battles to fight, still enemies to defeat, still purposes to serve. And as long as he could fight, could think, could act in accordance with the principles that had defined his existence for so long, he was still himself. Still Callan Vrask, warrior of the Hexixth Legion, servant of humanity's survival, even when that service required deception and secrecy. The knowledge that his service might be endless, that he might continue fighting for centuries or millennia to come, was daunting. But it was also, in its way, liberating. He didn't need to worry about death, about running out of time to achieve his objectives. He could take the long view, could plan operations that spanned years or decades, could pursue goals with the patience that had always been the Alpha Legion's greatest advantage. And perhaps somewhere in that vast expanse of potential future time, he would find what he was looking for, would make contact with other Alpha Legion survivors, would discover that he wasn't truly alone, would reconnect with the brotherhood that had defined so much of his identity. It might take another 50 years,
It might take 500, but he had time, endless time, to keep searching. The next morning, Vrask deployed with the Raptors against the Ork Warg. He fought with the precision and tactical awareness that had made him valuable even in an age where most of his contemporaries were dead. He struck from ambush positions, coordinated with his brothers to maximize the efficiency of their firepower, adapted his tactics to the specific characteristics of the enemy they faced. And in the moment of combat, in the pure focus that came with engaging the enemy, all the philosophical questions fell away. There was only the mission, only the target, only the immediate needs of the battle. It was the closest thing to peace that a warrior's life offered. Callan Vrask fought. And in fighting, in the continued execution of his duty despite the vast gulfs of time and circumstance that separated him from his origins, he found the answer to the question that had haunted him since his awakening. He would endure, he would adapt, he would serve. For as long as his mechanical body and organic mind held together, for as long as the galaxy needed warriors willing to fight in the shadows, he would continue. Because that was what the Alpha Legion had taught him. That was what he had become through decades of training and centuries of service. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that kind of endurance was its own form of victory. If you enjoyed exploring this deep dive into what happens when Orks capture an Alpha Legion Dreadnought and the existential questions that arise from 5,000 years of displacement, make sure to like and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content. The galaxy is vast, dark, and full of stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the Imperium's most unusual warriors.